Hi everyone, my name is Courtney Watts. I need to preface this presentation by sharing just how scared I am. So please bear with me as I might trip over my words. A lot of the most recent and accurate research surrounding autism challenges some of the most fundamental ideas surrounding the condition that have been long held as fact. Evidence shows that when we're presented with new information that doesn't align and cannot assimilate into what we currently know, it creates cognitive dissonance. In order to rectify the psychological distress, we either accept the new information, thereby altering our understanding of the world, or we reject it entirely, preserving the view of the world we had prior to the introduction of the information. Given just what has the potential to change for autistics, should I succeed here today? There's rather a lot of pressure to get it right. At its core, autism is a different way of experiencing the world, which leads to a communication mismatch between autistics and neurotypicals. This in turn leads to difficulties in building and maintaining relationships. We have negative experiences in communicating with people, and after so many attempts, eventually isolate ourselves for self-preservation. Better not to communicate with anyone than risk hurting someone's feelings or getting in trouble for saying the wrong thing, right? Being autistic often comes with co-occurring conditions. The list included is extensive, but definitely not exhaustive. It also comes with a lot of myths, the most prominent one being included in later slides. Much of the subtext in spoken communication is lost, which hinders autistic ability to comprehend the actual message being sent. This is exacerbated further if what the person is saying doesn't match their body language, people saying they're fine while crying, for example. The autistic community is also highly intersectional with the pride community. You're far more likely to come across a queer autistic than a straight cisgendered one. Cisgender people being those who see themselves as the gender they were assigned at birth. Autism is considered a dynamic disability. This means that how it's experienced changes over time, and so the supports and accommodations required vary from day to day, environment to environment. People with muscular dystrophy don't always require a mobility aid. Chronic illnesses such as endometriosis have good days and bad. As such, the expectations on a person with a dynamic disability needs to remain fluid, because what someone was capable of one day, they may not be capable of the next. Disclaimer: this is not a traditional professional presentation. Much of the jargon and complex terminology has been removed, so wording may appear juvenile. This is by design. Stress, chronic pain or illness, even color blindness can impact the ability to understand written content. All images have alt text enabled for full accessibility via text-to-speech. Tweets, memes, infographics, Tumblr threads, and comic strips have been pulled from the online autistic communities. With many autistics isolated from mainstream society, this is where you find autistic voices sharing their thoughts and feelings the most. Autism researchers recognize the value of such content, and these are the most accessible formats to neurodivergence due to their visual nature. Specific content has been selected from pages run by autistic self-advocates with academic expertise. Where factual claims are made, it is backed by the most current and relevant data, which is provided both on the slide and in the resource list. In order to share genuine and authentic autistic experiences, there will be content involved that may be considered distressing to some. Content warnings will be included where necessary. Autism is a neurodivergent condition. This means the connections within the brain develop differently to the majority of the population. Because of this, the way the world is perceived and experienced differs from a neurotypical person. A common barrier autistics face is being dismissed, being told that our understanding is specific to the individual and not indicative of the overall experience of autism. We are told, that's you maybe, but you're just one person, despite the fact that we share information the autistic community agrees on collectively. We also hear that as we are not scientists, researchers, professionals, or academics studying autism, we have no evidence to our experience's validity. So I found actually autistic scientists, researchers, professionals, and academics who have the privilege to be both autistic and recognised experts. The research argues that autistic people should be considered experts on autistic matters, not only due to our lived experience, but because special interests are an incredibly common autistic trait. This leads us to hyperfixate on something, wanting to learn everything about it. Often, when we receive our diagnosis, autism becomes our hyperfocus. We read all of the latest research and investigate further within autistic circles, giving us, as researchers have confirmed, expert-level knowledge. Now, why does this matter? A person living with a condition is obviously going to have more information on it, right? Well, like I mentioned before, autism has a high likelihood of co-occurring conditions, of which I have many. And based on past experiences, I'm not confident that sharing my knowledge and experience would be enough to cause the paradigm shift that is required to develop a full understanding of autism, to move from what was traditionally known to the far more accurate information that the growing number of autistic scientists are confirming. I could simply share what I know, but given just how rare an opportunity that it is that I've been given and exactly what is at stake, my anxiety will simply not allow for the potential dismissal of such new, somewhat radical ideas by not giving you the ample opportunity and resources to confirm this information for yourselves. I'm going to start by clearing the clutter, debunking long-held assumptions and beliefs that have remained all too common. The first is the myth that we don't experience empathy. Despite what is about to be a long-winded explanation, spoiler alert, we do. It's probably the most pivotal information you'll hear throughout this entire presentation, because it strips away the most basic of understandings of what autism is that has been held for so long in the world as common knowledge. Now, these slides are image heavy, but I'll be breaking them down. They've been included so when people are sent the presentation, all the information I discussed throughout is there. So, it started with Dr. Simon Baron Cohen's theory of mind, which was connected to his extreme male brain theory, which is as controversial as it sounds, and has directly contributed to the still ongoing battle for gender equality in seeking a diagnosis. More on that in a bit. The definition of empathy Baron Cohen put forward was challenged in 2019 by Fletcher, Watson, and Happ, who argued that understanding why people think and act the way they do and resonating with or responding to that knowledge were two completely different things. And by conflating the two, the expectation was put in place that you must respond in a certain way in order to be considered empathetic. Dr. Damien Milton's 2012 theory on the double empathy problem was the answer. That due to the lack of understanding of how an autistic brain works outside of actually autistic circles, our natural responses are not considered to be empathetic, and so the myth took its place in psychiatric journals as fact. This is a narrative that has taken decades to change, and therein lies the damage these myths have the potential to cause. Armed with both the fading validity of Baron Cohen's research thanks to Fletcher, Watson, and Happ, and the double empathy theory, Dr. Catherine Crompton from the University of Edinburgh sought to get an answer once and for all. Why do neurotypical and neurodivergent responses to the same information differ? I'm going to let Dr. Jack Den Houting tell you how it all worked out. Our very own homegrown, queer, autistic researcher, complete with their PhD in autism. This TED Talk is highlighted in red because of how important it is to see. I could explain Dr. Crompton's experiment myself, but I could not possibly hope to get the point across as eloquently as Dr. Houting does. Please note the content warnings. Our stats aren't pretty.
We know that the Earth is round. Everything we understand about this planet is grounded in the fundamental assumption that the Earth is round. But there was a time not all that long ago when we knew that the Earth was flat. That's called a paradigm shift. Our basic assumptions about the Earth changed because we had evidence showing that our previous assumptions were wrong. Just like the shape of the Earth, there are assumptions about autism too. Most people understand autism through medical assumptions. They understand autism as a medical condition, a disorder, even as a tragedy. In the medical paradigm, we're taught to believe that there's a correct way to develop neurologically, that there's a right way for our brains to work, the normal way, and that any other way of developing is wrong and needs to be treated and fixed. In 2011, when I was 25 years old, I was diagnosed with autism. And it wasn't a tragedy. It was the best thing that's ever happened to me. Finding out that I'm autistic, it brought me an overwhelming sense of relief. My whole life up to that point finally made sense. My paradigm about myself shifted. I wasn't a failed neurotypical person. I was a perfectly good autistic person. After my diagnosis, I did what most of us would probably do. I went to Dr. Google and I started researching autism. Eventually, I upgraded from Dr. Google. I did my PhD in autism, became a doctor myself, and today I'm proud to be one of a growing number of openly autistic people working in autism research. But in those early days, I wasn't running a complex research project. I was just trying to learn more about myself. And learn about myself I did. I was bombarded with information. I was bombarded with information about my deficits. Autism causes deficits in social interaction, deficits in communication, restricted and repetitive behaviours, sensory processing deficits. For me, that information just didn't make sense. Finding out that I'm autistic had completely changed my life for the better. How could something that was so positive for me be such a bad thing? So I went back to Dr. Google, but this time I dug deeper. I started to find information about autism that was written not by researchers or other professionals, but by actual autistic people. I discovered a thing called the neurodiversity paradigm. The neurodiversity paradigm is an alternative way of thinking about autism. It describes autism as a part of the range of natural variation in human neurological development. At its very simplest, autism is a different way of thinking. Just like biodiversity helps to create a healthy and sustainable physical environment, neurodiversity can help to create a healthy and sustainable cognitive environment. According to the neurodiversity paradigm, there are no right or wrong brains. All forms of neurological development are equally valid and equally valuable. And regardless of what type of brain you've got, all people are entitled to full and equal human rights and to be treated with dignity and respect. Now, that sounds a bit like a panacea. I know, treating people with dignity and respect. It just makes sense. You might be surprised then to learn that a pretty common way of reacting to this idea is, I don't know. I mean, it's all right for you, but it doesn't apply to everybody. What about this person? They're really autistic. They're not just different, they're disabled. Well, maybe you can't tell just by looking at me, but I'm disabled too. I'm not disabled by my autism, though. I'm disabled by my environment. This is another paradigm shift. The way that we're used to thinking about disability is based in a model called the medical model of disability. The medical model assumes that disability is an individual problem. It places disability within the disabled person, within me. For example, I really struggle with shopping malls. They're loud, they're brightly lit, they're unpredictable, they're full of people. The medical model would say that I struggle with shopping malls because there's a problem with the way that my brain processes that input, because I'm autistic. But there's another way to think about disability. It's called the social model of disability. In the social model, disability happens when a person's environment doesn't cater for their individual characteristics. In the social model, we don't refer to people with a disability. Disability isn't something that I carry around like luggage. Instead, we use the word disabled as a verb. Disability is something that's being done to me. I'm actively being disabled by the society around me. When I go to a shopping mall, I don't struggle because there's something wrong with me. I struggle because the shopping mall is designed in a way that doesn't cater to my needs. If we started designing shopping malls that were quiet, dimly lit, predictable, and sparsely populated, well, I'd still be autistic, but I might not be disabled by shopping malls anymore. Almost everything we know about autism stems from research that's based in medical assumptions and the medical paradigm. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars globally every year on autism research, and the vast majority of that research conceptualizes autism as a problem. Recently, I conducted a study examining how autism research funding has been invested in Australia over the past 10 years. Here's what I found. More than 40% of funding went to genetic and biological research, trying to find out why autistic people are the way we are and if there's a way to prevent it. Another 20% of funding went to research investigating treatments for autism, most of which are trying to find new ways to make autistic people just act a bit less weird. Only 7% of funding went to research investigating services to help autistic people. Why does this matter? Well, around 1 in 50 people are autistic. About 60% of autistic adults are under or unemployed. 87% of us have mental illness. Autistic people are 9 times more likely than the general population to die by suicide. We have an average life expectancy of just 54 years. And we deserve better. In 2012, an autistic researcher named Dr. Damien Milton proposed a new theory. He called it the double empathy problem. And what he suggested was this: maybe autistic people don't actually have social deficits. Maybe we just get along better with other people who think like us. Maybe autistic people socialise better with other autistic people, and non-autistic people socialise better with other non-autistic people. Maybe the difficulties that we see when autistic and non-autistic people try to socialise aren't because the autistic person has social deficits, but because autistic and non-autistic people are both bad at communicating in ways that make sense to the other. Now, to the autistic community, this made perfect sense. But a lot of autism researchers weren't so keen. I guess maybe they didn't like the idea that the whole history of autism research could be based on flawed assumptions. Luckily, in the last couple of years, a handful of autism researchers have jumped on board with the double empathy problem, and they've decided to test it scientifically. In one brand new study by Dr. Catherine Crompton from the University of Edinburgh. They did this using a task called a diffusion chain, which in Australia we know by the slightly politically incorrect name of Chinese whispers. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with it. You whisper a piece of information around a group of people, one by one, and you try to keep it as accurate as possible. And if you've played, you know that the accuracy part is pretty hard. The first person will whisper a perfectly innocent sentence like, "Today I need to pay my rent and get new tyres." But by the last person, "Donald Trump is president and the world's on fire." Well, in Edinburgh, they played that game with 3 groups of participants. The first group was all autistic people. The second group was all non-autistic or neurotypical people. And the third group was a combination of autistic and neurotypical people. The researchers found that the all autistic and all neurotypical groups were equally accurate in their information sharing, but the combined autistic and neurotypical group was significantly less accurate and less clear in their information sharing. That suggests that autistic and non-autistic people communicate equally well. It's the mismatch between those communication styles that causes the problems, exactly as the double empathy problem predicts. We need a paradigm shift in the way that we think about autism. We need to recognise that maybe acting less weird is not the best outcome for an autistic person. We need services and supports that will help us to live long, happy and fulfilling lives while respecting our right to be authentically autistic. And we need the kind of work that I do, research led by autistic people that answers the questions autistic people want answered. Because the earth is not flat, and I am not a tragedy. Thank you.
This video absolutely blew my mind. Of all the thoughts I had ever had about how I spoke growing up, the idea that I didn't have communication problems, that there was no fault in my wiring, was not one of them. I said I would be sharing the thoughts and feelings of the autistic community as a whole, and I can't in good conscience withhold the harsher aspects without compromising the integrity of the information being presented. Throughout the late 2010s, leading up to the diffusion chain experiment, an idea that had been picking up steam in the autistic community was that it was neurotypical people who had the communication deficits, that it was time the responsibility was removed from our shoulders and left for them to pick up. Included here are some of the more aggressive thoughts that resonated strongly in the community, and because of that they may be confronting. It was a revolutionary idea. Autistics didn't have communication deficits, but neither did neurotypicals. Then whose fault was it when communication breakdowns occurred? There is a long-held belief that if something goes wrong, someone has to be held responsible for it, usually in a punitive manner. With the results of the diffusion chain experiment came an unconsidered third option. It was neither party's fault. There was no blame to lay. We simply spent our entire lives up to this point not having access to that knowledge yet. The idea that there is no right way to communicate and that both styles are equally valid is not an idea that is easily accepted, because it means rethinking everything you know about autistic behaviour, everything you know about what is and isn't appropriate, everything you know about professionalism and social standards. But because of this, it is the most important idea presented today, because with that understanding comes a whole new horizon of potential for the autistic experience. It has been a very rare individual that has accepted me at face value, no question. Though based on this research, I'm now wondering if they were neurodivergent too, and that was why. My life's experiences, and in some cases, actual people, taught me that the best I could possibly hope for was tolerance. They might not like you, but be grateful they tolerate you. With the recognition that both parties are equally responsible for communicating effectively with the other, comes a new frontier of acceptance never experienced before. And with that acceptance, the stats from Dr. Howding's TED Talk have a far greater possibility of changing. It's necessary to pause here in order to make sure everyone understands what the greater implications of the diffusion experiment actually are. If autistics truly had communicative and social deficits, the all-autistic group should have been the least effective in their information sharing. This idea that Damien Milton proposed, Catherine Crompton proved, and Jack Den Howding has now shared in their viral TED Talk changed everything. What's wrong with the way I communicate? Nothing. There never was. Dr. Howding compared this new understanding of autism as a natural variation to the world coming to terms with the fact that the Earth was round when they had believed for so long that it was flat. And just like in that example, science had to reframe and reassess everything it knew about the Earth to accommodate this new information. All previous research associated with a flat Earth was invalidated, and now, so too is research that frames autism from within the medical model. With the growing number of actually autistic scientists building platforms, the landscape of autism research is dramatically changing at a rapid pace. It is a hope that when enough progress has been made in accepting autism as a natural developmental variation, we could see it removed from the DSM-V diagnostic manual as a psychiatric disorder forever. I told you it was a long-winded explanation, but aren't you glad you held in there? Another common myth, and likely another one that will be one of the hardest to accept, is the idea that autistics don't want to be around other people and would rather be alone. The online community got a big laugh out of this tweet due to how interested we would be in having that conversation. In actual fact, it's far more likely we crave connection more than neurotypicals do, simply because of how rare it is we find it. When we're young, at first it's confusing. We try different ways to make friends and don't understand what went wrong when we're rejected. Then the self-awareness of our difference kicks in, and so we try to copy. If I'm doing what they do, if I like what they like, they'll be my friend. If I follow every instruction perfectly, I won't get in trouble. If I can be normal and stop embarrassing my family, they'll love me. This idea can only be proven wrong so often before social anxiety develops. Fear about trying to connect with people kicks in and self-isolation takes over to protect you. Because you can't get hurt by people if you're not around them. And you can't fail if you don't try. With autism being a disability, it's common to believe you'd be eligible for disability payments from the government to supplement your income if you can't work full-time. But due to the unpredictable nature of dynamic disabilities, pinpointing exactly how much someone can work to determine their pension entitlements is almost impossible. As a result, payments are often rejected altogether. For the same reason, people tend to think autism, endometriosis, and other fluctuating chronic conditions aren't disabilities. Because if you don't understand what a dynamic disability is, then all you see is someone who can perform certain tasks one day, then claim not to be able to do them the next, which leads to a high level of skepticism that the person even has the disability they claim to. Then the cycle is perpetuated. People are rejected for payments, so they force themselves to work despite the detriment to their health. Then eventually, their condition deteriorates further to the point they can't work at all, and what could have been a supplemented income ends up being a permanent replacement. In autistics, this means further isolating ourselves. Without acceptance of the differences across neurotypes, expectations of autistic behaviour doesn't change, and the mental strain of trying to comply and the traumas and rejection sensitivity that occurs when we inevitably fail is what leads to that deterioration in our condition that eventually leads to autistics self-isolating from mainstream society permanently. Rejecting the idea that autism is disordered development opens the doors to acceptance that removes the barriers to autistic employment, leaving us with no need for disability payments. But until then, it's incredibly rare for autistics to get income support payments without having a co-occurring physical disability also. A lot of people think that if a child is given a diagnostic label, then people will treat them different. The problem with that logic is that not being labelled does little to stop those who would target a person because they're different. It does a lot for those who have that label, not just because of the positive impact that comes from understanding yourself better, but because it's easier to find and build connections within the communities that share your identity if you know what it is. We also need to consider the prejudice associated with disabilities and how the language we use, or in this case, avoid, actively contributes to negative feelings about having these conditions. When you avoid using direct terminology with a disability, it sends the message that it's not okay to have it, because if there's nothing wrong with being disabled, why avoid using the words related to it? It was once believed that autism was a solely male condition. This assumption was championed and reinforced by the traditional gender roles of the time. Boys would be quiet, withdrawn, deeply focused on individual tasks, and so they would be diagnosed as autistic. When this behaviour occurred in girls, they would simply be called girls, because that is how society expected girls to behave. When women were finally diagnosed, it was believed that this idea that autism only occurred in boys was caused by the fact that the presentation of autism was different in girls. Those who were socially assertive, loud, dominant, were originally diagnosed with personality disorders. Boys who behaved in this manner were simply called boys. And so a false dichotomy was artificially created, leading the medical and scientific communities to believe personality disorders were women's conditions and autism was a male condition. The female presentation of autism led to the understanding that non-males could be autistic too, but that historical belief still impacts current diagnostic rates and medical biases across the genders, specifically because they are labelled that way. AFABs, those assigned female at birth, struggle to get a diagnosis if they have the male presentation, and the opposite is true for AMABs, assigned male at birth. Because the traditional structure of gender roles remained within the medical system, even though they are steadily being dismantled in greater society. This gendering of presentations is proven inaccurate time and time again, with every person that presents in a way not aligned with their assigned gender at birth, and adds to the discriminatory medical practices faced by trans people who struggle to get any diagnosis of anything that isn't related to their trans identity or related hormone replacement therapy. If it's only been in the past decade or two that this dichotomy of presentations has slowly started to be deconstructed, getting those who are AFAB their autism diagnosis and getting those who are AMAB much needed recognition and support for personality disorders, but it is only the first step in a massive journey. Even now, statistics show a 3-to-1 ratio between AMABs and AFABs, and women and gender non-conforming people continue to report facing extensive barriers when seeking a diagnosis, creating a confirmation bias that males are more likely to be autistic, when raw data shows such a claim to be highly unlikely. The reason there seems to be so many more neurodivergents today than in the past was so perfectly summed up in this community thread that I couldn't possibly not include it. The world has changed. Everything is louder, brighter, faster, and so the people these things impact are more severely impacted as a result. Their difference to the typical is more easily noticed, and so a diagnosis is a more likely result. Autistics have always existed, in all the ways described here, historically being discarded, left to our own devices, or accused of not being human, like in the myth of the changeling child, but still existing. The higher rates of neurodivergent diagnoses isn't because there's suddenly more of us, but because it's getting easier to recognize us, due to both the rapid technological advancement we've experienced in the past century, exacerbating these conditions, and a greater understanding of what they are. As mentioned before, autistics isolate themselves for self-preservation after traumatic social experiences leave us unwilling to make further attempts. This asocial behaviour of removing ourselves from society altogether feels like a significantly better option than being consistently labelled antisocial due to to our lack of social customs being taken as intentionally malicious. Despite a large number of autistics genuinely not understanding how to participate effectively in the social norms, or knowing how but being unable to wrap their heads around the why enough to actually engage in them, a ridiculous idea was born in the wake of Mark Zuckerberg's refusal to remove certain Facebook posts last year, and was further reinforced when Elon Musk announced that he was autistic in May of this year. The idea? That autistics can't be racist, and by extension, can't be discriminatory in any other capacity either. People attributed Zuckerberg's awkward and toneless social demeanour to autism, heard the reports that during talks with the Colour of Change president, he seemed to lack any and all comprehension of the racial issues they were discussing as being intricately tied to the Facebook posts he refused to remove. And just like that, it was out there that for the same reason we struggle to learn social norms, we are also protected from socially learning racism. I share my views now only because so many in the autistic community echoed my thoughts at how ridiculous this idea was. Do I understand racism? Short answer, no. Longer answer, I know what it is. I know what it looks like. I know the impact it has on the world. But I don't think I'll ever understand why it happens. Humanity being placed in a hierarchy based on completely arbitrary reasons that leads people to believe one life has more value, that makes no sense to me. This idea that so rapidly and insidiously infiltrated the autistic communities all over the world added further to our dehumanization, because what human being cannot understand the impact of racism or recognize it when it happens? When people meet an autistic person, certain assumptions tend to be made about what to expect from them by ways of speech, behavior, sensory sensitivity, and capability. But the range of variation between autistic individuals is exactly the same as that of neurotypicals. No two autistics are the same. This list of autistic traits is the most extensive I've ever seen, but it is in no way exhaustive. And no autistic has them all. I won't be going through them all, but definitely a slide you want to look through at a later date. The specific traits, how those traits are experienced, personal demographics, and the current environment all impact the autistic lived experience, and as such, the number of possible ways an autistic can experience life is infinite. Presuming to know what traits an autistic person will have prior to meeting them will likely result in embarrassment for everyone involved. No autistic wants the pressure of someone assuming they're a genius thanks to characters like Sheldon, House, and the Good Doctor, when we experience the same range of intelligence as neurotypical people do. Autistic meltdowns are usually seen as tantrums because the person didn't get their way. And while there's some truth to that, it wildly oversimplifies the issue, damaging the ability to find a resolution when it occurs or avoid such situations entirely. Autistics absolutely thrive on routine and structure. This familiarity allows us to plan and prepare for what to expect, reducing anxiety of the unknown. When something occurs outside of that plan, aka something doesn't go our way, it causes real psychological and physiological distress. The thresholds for how much of this distress can be experienced before an autistic shutdown or meltdown occurs is different person to person and environment to environment. A change at home may cause significantly less distress than one at school because there are so many other familiar, static, knowable things compensating for that one change at home. The important takeaway is that there are signs of distress each autistic expresses that, if recognized and resolved, can greatly reduce the chance of autistic shutdown or meltdown. But if it does happen, the seemingly small, innocuous thing that triggered it was just the straw. This distress can build for hours, days, even weeks before the threshold is hit and overload occurs. It's also important to note that the internal experiences of a shutdown and a meltdown to an autistic are exactly the same. It's only the outward expression of that overload that changes. It's similar to an absent versus a traditional epileptic seizure. In an absent seizure, the body doesn't convulse. but the same electrical activity in the brain is occurring in both cases. The benefit of routine and structure is the familiarity that stems from doing, eating, seeing the same things. It's why we tend to watch the same TV shows or movies, read the same books, listen to the same music, eat the same foods over and over again. The predictability means we know what to expect, which lowers the anxiety level around what we're doing. Because of the higher anxiety associated with new things, it's easier to just avoid them. But that's not always possible, and we do definitely consider that we could be missing out on something enjoyable. In these instances, clarification questions bridge the gap. This is something new? Okay, what is it? What's included? How do I do it? What's the purpose of doing it? What's the result supposed to look like? What are the steps involved? What materials do I need? If I don't have what I need, what happens then? Are there substitutes or alternatives? Which of the things involved are suggestions and which are hard and fast rules? If they're rules, why? What happens if they're broken? Is it a safety rule where I could be injured? Or a respect and kindness rule where people might get hurt? An information rule where if the steps aren't followed properly, the answers won't be correct and valid like science or maths. These questions can seem relentless. It can also feel like the answers are obvious or that the information we already have is enough. I can assure you, if we felt that way, the compulsion to ask wouldn't be there. It's also common, particularly in younger people, to interrupt to ask them, because knowing you're being expected to do something and not knowing the answers to the questions you have about it leaves you unable to effectively plan and execute the task, which is distressing enough to overtake the necessity of complying with conversational turn-taking and hand-raising that's usually required in these situations. There's also the fear that if we don't ask there and then in that moment, we'll forget what the question was. I cannot stress enough how important it is to recognize and validate the need for these questions, and to not see them, especially if it was done with an interruption, as a malicious attempt to destabilize the authority in the situation, or to purposely lead the conversation off topic. Getting answers and having someone be patient and compassionate with you asking them is directly correlated with a greater ability to engage in a task and a higher level of well-being overall due to the reduced anxiety. Equally important is to recognize that it's not about questioning authority, it's about feeling confident that we know exactly what we're doing. Also worthy to note, the more accepting of these questions a person is, the safer and more trustworthy they become. It's a lot easier to be open to new ideas when they're being introduced by someone who has proven to be supportive in the past. A hyperfixation is an intense area of interest and is one of the many crossover traits autism has with ADHD. It starts with an idea, the tiniest hint of an idea, sparked by something we've seen. An ad, a show we walked in on someone watching, a game a sibling was playing, even school learning activities. One primary school literacy activity had me creating secret code messages as my only means of communication for weeks. It was the quietest my house and classroom had ever been in my entire life up to that point. So it starts with that initial peak in interest that, at first, dies out and we go about our business. But our mind keeps circling back around to what we saw. An idea formulates, a plan kicks in to execute it, and down the rabbit hole we fall. How long a hyperfixation lasts is dependent on what it is and how much information about it is out there to find. Topics that have seemingly endless wells of information, either due to knowledge of it developing as time goes on, such as science-based topics, or new information being added frequently, like the Marvel Universe or TV show spin-offs, are more likely to be longer-lived than interests that have limited information available. Because once we reach a point where we're not receiving new information anymore, the need to actively engage drops and interest dwindles. These things still remain areas of expertise and join the rotation of vetted, familiar activities, shows, books, experiences that we continue to come back to. Not all hyperfixations grow into fully fledged spins. If the topic is not rich enough in information content, the material is too complex to feel confident in full comprehension, or we find the initial investigations aren't as engaging as we expected them to be, hyperfocus teeters off and the topic is abandoned. Spins are often a cause of contention at home and in the classroom. Even with much of the current literature acknowledging the positive well-being aspects for autistics, the neurotypical interpretations continue to include negative impacts, most notably the inability to shift focus from and likelihood of getting distracted by the spins. Interestingly, however, the raw data says different. An experiment tested the likelihood of distractibility across two types, social and object. The object distractors were specifically geared towards high-interest topics in both the autistic and neurotypical groups. The neurotypical group had a high distractibility rate from the set task in the social condition compared to the object condition. The opposite wasn't true for autistics, showing that neurotypical people are far more likely to be distracted from what they're doing by their friends than autistics are to be distracted by their spins. A love language is an expression of affection, which, commonly understood, is vastly different in neurodivergence compared to neurotypical people. We simply do not show that we care in the same ways. Info dumping is unloading all the information you have about a topic, usually the latest hyperfocus. Parallel play, the act of being alone, together. Support swapping is trading off tasks based on strengths and struggles. Soul crushing is all about deep proprioceptory pressure, using someone's full body weight, often in a bear hug, to meet the sensory need. Sharing found objects or unconventional gift giving is about giving someone something you find valuable to send the message that you find them valuable. Like described here, these objects very rarely hold any sort of monetary value. A common one these days is memes. I cannot stress enough that while these are intimate behaviours, they are not inherently romantic. As a love language, it takes a certain amount of vulnerability to feel comfortable and safe enough with a person to express them, regardless of neurotype, whether it's with a romantic partner, a friend, or family. When most people think of autistic stimming, they picture hand flapping, tapping, sometimes even repetitive tics. Tics are actually not stimming, as the person isn't in control of how and when tics occur. Stimming is a repetitive behaviour that provides input to any of the body's senses for comfort, and everybody does it. That calm feeling when you drink something warm, the soft sensation of your dog's fur relieving your sadness, the bouncing of your leg when you're nervous or excited. Stimming. You are providing sensory input to alleviate discomfort, and so because autistics often struggle with sensory issues, self-regulation, and typical emotional expression, the ongoing relentless nature of the discomfort means we do it more often, and it's likely to be more noticeable due to the intensity required to bring us back into balance. When external sensory input or internal mental load becomes overwhelming, a common reflexive response is to dissociate, to protect ourselves from invasive thoughts, uncomfortable topics, or pain. The brain disconnects from the body so the messages can't get through. This can vary from zoning out when there's a lot on your mind, to complete anhedonia, where all physical and emotional sensations are dulled or repressed from being felt. Autistic shutdown is when this occurs for an extended period of time, though dissociation usually acts as a protective function specifically to prevent the body from going into a full shutdown. Autistics are often confused when we learn that neurotypical people think in words. I have to admit, even I had a slight existential crisis when I started investigating this further. A constant inner monologue is on the list of common autistic traits, but it is heavily reported that autistics don't have one at all. The confusion is often around the autistic believing inner monologue means the process of how we think, before then being told that in neurotypicals the meaning is literal, that thought processes occur in physical words. My mind was blown. I was confused because I was 1000% sure that my inner monologue was words and they never stop. I was an incredibly hyperverbal child. Even now, despite that dying down, people thinking I never shut up is still common. They would be horrified to learn that even in my hyperverbal states, I barely manage to keep up with my brain. These days, for every one thing I say, there's another 20 I don't. I investigated further, and I found that it wasn't that autistics don't have an inner monologue, it's that it occurs in images, colours, or fantasy sequences, where the words we are thinking is in dialogue form, picturing sharing the information that we're thinking with a hypothetical person in a non-existent scenario. And I was like, oh, surely I think in words outside of pretend conversations. But I couldn't think of a single time that I had. Whenever I think about anything in words, it's in dialogue format, often like the examples here, rehearsing future conversations or rehashing old ones that continue to haunt me. This dialogue with a hypothetical person is often with our very own brain. We're talking to ourselves and imagining responses, either from the brain as a whole or from different parts of our identity or personality, like Inside Out if Riley could actually talk to her feelings. Co-occurring ADHD tends to lend itself to faster and more incessant trains of thought. This is also common with anxiety disorders, because the inner monologue continues to circle back to the issues causing it, whether it's a social interaction in which I failed miserably, or going over and over the plans for each task on the to-do list that never seems to get any smaller. It's part of the reason getting some form of response from an autistic before you start talking, particularly given how many of us also have ADHD and or anxiety disorders, because we're likely to miss the beginning due to the processing delay from having to detach from the inner monologue and come back into the moment. The way the brain processes information is dependent on many different factors. Stress levels, prior knowledge and experiences, and biological medical factors all impact how we take in new information when it's presented and how quickly and efficiently we do so. That's part of the reason such radically new ideas like this can be so confronting, because your prior knowledge is saying something different. The deconstruction of what you knew to develop the new understanding, making connections from the newly presented idea to what you already know, while actively trying to disregard the outdated knowledge that isn't valid anymore, is a longer and harder process than simply taking in new information and connecting it to what you already know in order to understand it. Take a new sound, for example. You hear a low drone. You turn to the sound to pinpoint where it's coming from. You connect the sound to that of an aeroplane and look to the sky. It's similar but not quite the same. You see a helicopter. It's another type of aircraft. It fits in with what you already know. Processing of that sound to the identification was slower due to hearing it for the first time, but in the future it'll be faster. But what if you weren't familiar with aircrafts? What if everything you knew about the world led you to believe such weight couldn't possibly be lifted off the ground? It would be incredibly confronting to see it, far more disturbing to hear the noise. Likely, you wouldn't even think to look up to the sky to find the answers. Processing what you're seeing, hearing, and feeling is harder and takes longer when it conflicts with prior knowledge. It can also be delayed or take more steps due to distractors throwing off the process or medical conditions that cause the messages to take longer to get through. In things like conversations or movies, the processing delay caused by the brain tripping over the feeling of our clothes, crickets outside, people or objects moving too quickly or erratically, it means a lot of the brain's bandwidth is already being used, so processing the words spoken in order to understand them takes longer. Then, due to our incessant inner monologue in the forms of memories, images, and feelings, it takes time to put those things into a coherent sentence in order to respond, especially if they're emotional in nature rather than factual. I know what I want to say, I just don't know how to say it. This leads to a longer than expected gap between a question and the answer, or a statement and the response, which can lead to people believing we weren't paying attention, especially if the sensory distractors were enough that we weren't able to pick up everything that was said, because when someone says something, it doesn't get processed in real time, it gets repeated back, like a recording, with the distractors filtered out. A common occurrence is to say we didn't hear, or admit we weren't listening even though that wasn't true, because giving the immediate answer of "I don't know" circumvents the necessity of finding a way to respond. This doesn't mean we don't have a response. It means that the pressure to deliver the response in words immediately is overwhelming. The other option is to try and respond, but the pressure to answer quickly is still there. So the answer comes out garbled nonsense, or we experience selective mutism from the pressure to respond, overloading the brain to the point we can't physically get one out at all. We get a "we are having some technical difficulties, we will return to your regularly scheduled programming soon" message, mixed with a buzz of TV static, and that's it. People get frustrated, and we can tell. Often they take the delay as a refusal to answer altogether because so much time has passed. Disrespectful and rude. Why would you just blatantly ignore me like that? The consequences of "I don't know" is a lot less psychologically distressing. While most autistics are more sensorily aware, not all of us experience debilitating sensory sensitivities. And like the spectrum shows, what we find debilitating and when changes based on sleep, health, social and environmental factors. Fluorescent lights don't bother me usually, but if the room is loud and my back hurts and I'm worrying about a sick pet, the lights can turn from something I wouldn't consciously notice as causing distress, until I turned them off and felt relief, into the straw that breaks me. The more sensitive we are to a specific input, the more distress and pain we experience when exposed to it. And when that threshold is reached, it's the same as reaching your pain threshold. Once you've reached it, all coherent thought disappears and it's just pain and screaming and the desperation to make it stop. That's an autistic meltdown, not a tantrum, an overwhelming level of physical and psychological pain. Interoception is quite a complex idea. I only heard of it for the first time last year, and I got a great deal of understanding about how my body works and why it works that way that I never had before. As a kid, I could never tell if I was going to be physically sick. I got into a lot of trouble because why couldn't I just get to the toilet if I thought I was going to be sick? Well, because I could never tell when I was going to be sick. My brain can also mix up its comprehension of shivering. Because of traumatic experiences being sick when I was younger, I get very scared when I feel like I'm getting sick. I also get the shakes through my entire body. But we also shake when we're cold. So I have to be very careful to make sure I don't get cold enough to shiver, because my brain will often interpret it as me getting sick. I'll start to feel nauseous, helpless, and scared even though I'm not sick, I'm just cold. Now I make a point of keeping food wherever I go, and I use the bathroom wherever I walk past one. I have no build-up feelings. I go from not hungry to starving within just a few minutes. I go from first feeling the need to use the bathroom to being in pain in just a shorter period of time. I can still control those muscle groups. It's the messages of increasing urgency from my bladder or stomach to my brain that aren't being received or recognized. It's part of the reason the transition from teaching primary school to teaching high school worked so well for me. I have the opportunity to use the bathroom or have a few bites to eat every hour or so. Others aren't as lucky as me. Some people don't get any cues at all, or may have a co-occurring condition that also impacts the ability to control certain muscle groups, and as a result wear pads or diaper-style underwear well into adulthood. They eat on a timed schedule or by tracking their blood sugar. These neurodivergents tend to fall in the most infantilized groups, because people often relate recognizing these inner bodily cues as part and parcel of being a fully functioning adult. And so if we can't, well then we must still need to be parented or cared for, even among those with no mobility or intellectual impairments. It's important to understand what interoception is So the misconception that the inability to feel or recognize these cues means that you have or need less bodily autonomy or decision-making control over your life disappears. Communicating in social arenas is one of the big three of autism, besides our spins and structured expectation of routine and familiarity. The pressure to perform well in social situations significantly lowers our chances of doing so, but the only way to remove that pressure is to know what to say and when. So it feels like this bunny comic. I need to access the scissors, but I can only get to them with more scissors. And the only way that cycle is broken is by feeling comfortable saying whatever comes naturally to us without fear of backlash. Standing with a person or group, engaging in a conversation is scary. Will I have anything relevant to say? What if I say the wrong thing? If I interject with a joke here, will it be funny or offensive? They just said something and everybody laughed. What did I miss? I don't get it. Being around a team of people familiar with autism means when I miss a joke, I can just go, I don't get it, and they'll explain. But I'm not always around those people. And being looked at like you're dumb or getting the oh so condescending, think about it line is just one reason in a list of many we give up trying to socialize. Subtext differences are the cause of the mismatch in communication across neurotypes. Neurotypicals use it to soften their words, get a message across nicer, or to avoid seeming too forward or aggressive. Autistics don't, to ensure the message they intend to send is exactly the one that's received on the other end. When you mix the two, neither gets their way. Neurotypicals are frustrated we're not getting the message, and we're getting frustrated that our direct and straightforward message was picked apart for a deeper hidden meaning that was never there. I once told my sister her fake smile made her look like the Joker from the 80s cartoon because of the curl in the corner of her lips. It was nothing more than a comparative description. Yet people blew up at me, saying I called her ugly, which she isn't, or that I said it was a bad photo, which it wasn't, and neither of those things was what I said. There was no deeper message to my comment, but they found one anyway, and my intent, or lack thereof, didn't matter. Neurodivergents do not deal with small talk. Existing in corporeal form is hard enough, let alone adding interactions to it. It's been observed that neurotypicals connect to the person, so the content of a conversation doesn't matter, while autistics connect to the content, and through the content, the person. So if those interactions aren't going to be meaningful, they are rarely considered worth it. Reaching out to your neurodivergent students or children should be prefaced with your intent, because until you declare it, our minds are running wild with all the possibilities. What did we do? What do they want? Why are they talking to me? Seemingly innocuous questions like, how are you and what'd you do last night, feel invasive because our gut response is to answer them. So when the response isn't the socially mandated, I'm good, you? And not much, it gets real awkward real fast. And when this is coming from a teacher or a parent, the feeling of suspicion and paranoia at being approached stems from the assumption we've done something wrong and we're about to get in trouble. So when you walk away after talking about the weather for a few minutes and it takes another 15 before our heart rate dips back below 100, you can understand why these are not the most desirable of feelings. Be direct in your approach. Hey mate, don't mind me, I'm just here doing the rounds. Or, I know you've been having a tough time and I wanted to reach out to make sure you know we're here if you need support. Or, hey, I heard about the situation yesterday at recess last period. I was hoping you'd come and have a chat with me about it, see what solutions we can come up with. No matter what the reason is being approached, good, bad, or neutral, we always appreciate being direct and meaningful. This one is a heavy hitter. The wrong thing has been said or done, someone gets angry, and we're left there alone in the aftermath trying to figure out what the hell happened. In the moments we do get the chance to ask, the responses are always the same. If you don't know what you did, I can't help you. Or figure it out. And it's like, or, and hear me out here, you could be an adult and actually communicate with me about what the problem is so it can be resolved. Instead, it's believed that whatever caused offence was intentional, and therefore we know what it is and are just playing dumb as a means to avoid accountability. And that's just not the case. This commonly occurs in what I refer to as the tell me honestly scenario. Someone asks you to tell them the truth, or to give it to them straight, or be honest, and when you are, chaos. And it's scenarios like that where even the most blunt and direct neurotypical instruction blows up in our face that leads us to never trusting social situations. Because even when we think we can't possibly get it wrong, we still do. Seriously, reblog to save an autistic. Don't ask for an honest answer unless you actually want one. A common result of ongoing negative reactions to the things we say and do is to over-explain. So often have people misread our message and intentions in the past that we feel the need to explain it in great detail to make sure it doesn't happen again. It comes from the desperate need to make sure people actually hear what it is we're trying to say, so we explain the same thing in many different ways so we're understood. Unfortunately, this often leads people to think we're lying, with longer, more detailed responses being considered a sign of dishonesty. The literal mindset in how autistics view language can lead to not understanding jokes, puns, irony, because the language used and their meaning don't match. While this is common in a lot of us, keep in mind what we learned in the misconceptions section. Not every autistic has every trait, so there are still plenty of us out there that do understand these things. Also interesting to note was that in a cross-cultural study, neurotypical Americans performed terribly on an idioms test where the idioms were European, further confirming the double empathy problem of Damien Milton's that neither group communicates badly, just differently. These communication differences, when combined with negative social experiences that result, means that by the time autistics reach working age, the idea of being around a whole new social group of people to get to know, to avoid upsetting, to communicate effectively with, in an adult setting with responsibilities and professional standards and expectations of certain levels of productivity, likely with few effective accommodations, if any at all, or the emotional maturity and language to articulate the need for them and what those needs are, is terrifying. Heart racing, adrenaline-filled, fight or flight, can't breathe, can't think, can't speak, get in, get it done, don't talk to anybody, don't look at anybody, don't ask questions, don't pass out, go home and pass out there. Terrifying. How do I cope so well, you ask? I don't. Anyone who has received an email from me knows this description here is pretty on point. I try to be direct so there's no confusion, but then I worry it's too blunt, so I use like 3 question marks instead of 1 to show that I'm confused and I'm just trying to clarify my understanding rather than questioning the situation or the authority of the people involved. Or I use a lot of exclamation points to show I'm excited and being friendly to take the edge off the potential perception of bluntness. When autistics don't feel safe or comfortable to behave in a way that feels natural, we become hypervigilant. We police our behaviours, words, even thoughts, all for the purposes of being accepted by those around us. But negative reactions are often easier to combat than overtly positive ones. We don't want performative praise of autism. We're not superheroes, we're not geniuses, we're not so brave for sharing our diagnosis. We're just people. And being autistic is not something to either be excited or saddened by. If there's to be any reaction, let it be a neutral one. Needing to tell someone something can take days or even weeks to mentally prepare for it, even if we do know what we want to say. Knowing what we need to say can be the easy part. It's the fear of the unknown and potentially negative responses that stops us from sharing it. This makes it harder when it comes to hard-hitting topics where there are strongly conflicting opinions. things we're passionate about, self-advocacy, because we know the response isn't going to be a good one. But staying silent to avoid confrontation leads to poorer mental health over these issues. And the idea of not saying something damages our sense of integrity, because if we feel a certain way and don't share it, it feels dishonest, like lying by omission. Autism Advocacy holds a lot of controversial opinions, the least of which being that autistics should be the first point of call for information about autism, especially in relation to autistics experiences. I sent an email to our fearless leader about the incredible I Can Autism Virtual Expo, free, online, no one would necessarily have to take the day off to attend. Countless free resources built and delivered with actually autistic academics, advocates and students to ensure educators have knowledge that could be a game changer with their autistic students. It took me almost 2 weeks to build up the courage to send that email. I was excited and relieved when it was received well, and I was told it would be passed on to the deputy in charge of professional learning. In the following weeks, I sent it to the deputy myself and a head teacher. I told myself life is hectic. People are busy. I can't expect immediate responses or that anyone will want to take part. 2 days before the expo, still not having heard back, I sent my first ever school-wide email, sharing the expo information directly. My fear and apprehension that there could be a negative backlash had me scripting for days, practicing what I would say if people came back with questions or particular opinions or thoughts on my having sent the email to everyone. It seems like such a dramatic and over-exaggerated response, but that's social anxiety and rejection sensitivity. That's what being told you've said or done something wrong over and over again does. You start to automatically assume whatever you say or do in any situation, positive, negative or neutral, is going to be bad. With rejection sensitivity being invasive thoughts, they can come out of nowhere and be almost impossible to ignore or resolve, especially alone. Even recognizing these thoughts for what they are might not help, because regardless of whether we know it's an irrational thought or not, it doesn't change the fact that it could be true. Knowing you experience it means you can head it off faster, and it's easier with objective reassurance. But if you don't trust that the person reassuring you isn't going to tell you the truth, even if it hurts, the intrusive thoughts won't go away. It also helps if your person has higher authority than you, because it provides both professional and personal reassurance. A lot of the time, all I need to hear is that people will be honest with me. The intrusive thoughts are that people don't like me, I've offended or upset someone, but they're just too polite and professional to say anything about it. When I recently recognized those thoughts for what they were, I found the most blunt, direct person in my team and said, "I can trust you to tell me if I mess up, right?" It worked perfectly, and now I have that strategy. I have to say though, it only works in arenas where you're invested in the social climate. If I'm in an unfamiliar environment or around new people who don't know me and I upset them, I'm likely already in a heightened state where my attitude will be that if they're not going to raise the issue with me to resolve it, they're cordially invited to stay mad about it, because I can guarantee that I have no idea what's going on outside of my own head. Masking is an incredibly complex idea. Please note the content warnings. While considered an autistic trait, it isn't inherently so. It's a response to rejection. We latch on to the behaviours that are accepted and welcomed in neurotypical people, and we strive to emulate them. But in actively suppressing our natural behaviours in favour of socially acceptable ones, we have less ability to think about and focus on other things. We have less mental bandwidth to cope with sensory sensitivities, follow the threads of the conversation, create text-to-text, self and world connections when learning about something new, damaging our ability to learn that content. The mental load for a neurotypical teen is already high. Adding in autistic sensory sensitivities that have them tearing at their uniform, struggling with fluorescent lighting and panicking at not being able to focus on a specific voice because of the hum of the air conditioner, increases the risk of shutdown and meltdown 100-fold. Then you add the intense, invasive thoughts that pervade everything they do to mask, analysing every word, every movement, every choice to make sure it's the right one, whatever that is, and it becomes easier to understand that no one could possibly keep that up without eventually breaking. Consider teaching. We have to present ourselves a certain way for the class. Then back in the staff room, we can relax a little. Then when the bell rings and the kids are gone, we can relax further. Then again, once we reach our car, then eventually home. The highest fear levels are in those face-to-face teaching moments where you're surrounded by students who are watching you, because the highest judgments of your competence are in those moments. Holding yourself together for a few hours to then be able to relax, even a little bit, offers relief. But by the end of the year, many teachers report the teacher burnout. To be on all the time, to not be able to drop the ball, to make sure nothing slips through the cracks. It's mentally and physically draining. Some freaks of nature can finish up on the last day of school and hit their holiday running, but many of us describe needing a significant amount of the holidays to simply recover and recharge for the upcoming year. Autistic masking is that face-to-face type stress, amplified beyond comprehension, and either you fail at it, risking social relationships, rejection, getting in trouble, or you succeed by faking it. I think succeeding is worse than failing. I failed. No matter how much I tried to force myself to behave in a way that would get people to accept me, my unmedicated ADHD lack of focus meant I kept forgetting that's what I was meant to be doing. Because of that, I've been spared a lot of the damage that comes with successful masking. Some autistics get so good at it, they can't physically stop. And so when a burnout is coming for them like a wild animal, it's like they tied themselves to a tree to survive a cyclone. They saved themselves from the storm, but now they can't get out of the way of the stampede, and the fallout is catastrophic. This is where burnout happens. The prolonged state of heightened psychological stress required to mask does exactly the same thing to autistics as it does to everyone else. Anxiety and depression sets in, sleep is impacted, which is already a common complaint in autistics. Self-esteem drops even further than the low level it already is due to social stresses, and eventually, the body starts to break down. Autistic burnout is the withdrawal from the world to a quiet, safe space to recover and heal. But that's not automatically the result. The more damage there is, the less likely they are to recover and re-emerge, permanently withdrawing from society, if they survive the process at all. A lot of what leads to the stats Dr. Howding mentioned starts long before an autistic ever reaches the workplace. I was incredibly privileged in how straightforward receiving my diagnosis was, but few autistics ever get a formal diagnosis as easy as I did, and the older you are, the harder it gets. But no matter when, if ever, a diagnosis is received, the feeling of knowing you're different starts with school. Once at school, sensory input grows while control over the environment drops. Social differences between peers becomes more pronounced. If there's any information I'd stake my professional reputation on, it's that there isn't a psychiatrist in the world that can diagnose autism faster than an 8-year-old bully that recognizes you're different. Professional educators may or may not recognize something is going on, with a disturbing trend occurring among educators where the more we think we know about autism, the less actual expertise we have. This trend becomes more distressing in higher education, where lecturers dismissing or refusing neurodivergent accommodations despite the legal obligation to provide them is a common occurrence. This othering is what's described here in the quote from a research paper released in October of this year. The dominant majority views autism as a problem, something that's wrong with the person. Young autistics internalize this prejudice and so reject that part of themselves, not wanting to learn about what it means for them to be autistic, creating yet another barrier in their education long before the idea of higher education is even a thought. Acceptance from society as a whole of the idea that neurodivergence is a natural variation of human existence and not something to fix means acceptance from schools, family, and peers, which then leads to acceptance of themselves. This starts with education. Knowing more about something and a willingness to share that information freely is directly correlated with a lower level of prejudice on the topic. Educators understand neurodivergent needs better, which reduces the likelihood of negative experiences at school. The positive relationship with education is preserved and nurtured, leading to a greater likelihood of seeking higher education, less of us in poverty, and more of us in professions like education, providing much needed representation for neurodivergent students they won't see otherwise. I explored the online teaching communities for New South Wales. Between the 19,000 teachers on the New South Wales Casual Teaching Facebook page alone, we've worked across most of the New South Wales territory, covering public, Catholic, and independent schools. Based on self-IDing and people they knew from each of the schools they were a part of, less than 20 neurodivergent teachers were identified, and often identification was prefaced by saying the teacher did not feel safe disclosing. I spent 27 years of my life wondering what was wrong with me. I've spent the past 2 since my diagnosis trying to figure out how the answers my diagnosis gave could possibly fit into the professional occupation of teaching, or any professional arena for that matter. I struggle with professional speech. Often my mouth is saying whatever thought crossed my mind before my brain can even comprehend that I'm talking. I can't layer or soften what I need to say without feeling disingenuous. It feels like lying. Trying to appropriately word something is an agonizing process, because I either risk not getting my point across or I risk being reprimanded for my tone, and I don't even know what that means. I can't wear professional clothes. Business wear is itchy and restrictive and impacts the ability of my chest to expand, which makes me feel like I can't breathe. Meetings and other professional forums I find incredibly intimidating, and the resulting behavior from that fear and anxiety often leaves me feeling like an incompetent child with imposter syndrome. Silent or rambling. There is no in between. This image shows the reverse of the multiple minority effect. Just like there are more barriers you face being a member of multiple minority communities, the more balloons of privilege you carry assist you in flying over them. Take a close look at each of these balloons and what they represent. The least privileged person here is at the bottom of the hill. They are a queer, non-male person of colour in a non-Christian denomination with low socioeconomic status, education, and mental health. The only balloon of privilege they have is that of an able body, and they're using that one privilege they do have to help the person who doesn't have it, despite the person they're helping having more balloons of privilege than they do. Now see here. This cis-educated, able-bodied person is a queer woman of colour, not practicing a religion within the Christian denomination, and has low socioeconomic status and poor mental health. They're being helped up the hill by a cis-hetero disabled woman of colour with low access to educational opportunities, but both high mental health and socioeconomic status. This specific example shows how the experience of these women of colour are not the same due to being impacted by sexuality, mental health, and socioeconomic factors. This person having a higher socioeconomic status means being able to afford healthcare, which allows them to get glasses, a necessary accommodation for their disability. It allows for greater access to mental health services, and that is also positively impacted. The privileges we have being used to assist those that don't have them, as well as understanding what the different parts of our identity are and what impact they're likely to have on each other, is what intersectionality is all about. What privilege do I lack that I need to seek assistance to get? And more importantly, what privileges do I have that I can actively use to help others get them too? Multiple minority status has been shown to have a cumulative effect on self-esteem and well-being. Understanding how different minority identities intersect is pivotal to raising, teaching, and caring for autistic people, because every person's experience of being autistic is impacted by their race, gender, sexuality, what religion they were raised in. Without taking these factors into account, you don't get the whole picture. One of the largest intersecting relationships in the autistic community is with the pride community. Autistics are 6 times more likely to be trans. Many are non-binary, meaning that they are not a man or a woman, and many are asexual, meaning that the connection between finding something physically attractive and experiencing physiological arousal in the body rarely or never occurs. So sex just doesn't cross your mind spontaneously. Both of those things can still occur independently, recognizing features in people that you consider attractive and experiencing arousal in general, blood movement, rapid heart rate, higher respiratory rate, as these things occur in our fight and flight response, which is a form of physiological arousal just as sexual arousal is. The predominant theory as to why the Venn diagram of the neurodivergent and pride communities is damn near a circle is because the neurodivergent conditions specifically impact social learning. The implicit, subtle messages many children are raised with that promote the status quo of cis heteronormativity go completely over our heads. We just don't hear it. And in the explicit prejudicial attitudes against the pride community that we hear make no sense. So we ignore it or actively fight it. I truly believe there are just as many queer neurotypicals as there are neurodivergents. But because we are less likely to internalize these prejudices when we hear them, if we hear them at all, then coming to terms with not being cis or straight happens faster, earlier, and easier, because we're less likely to be in denial about it. For an autistic, we already feel out of place, especially if we don't know we're autistic, because we know we're different, we just don't know why. When it comes to our gender identity, we think, okay, in order to know if I'm a man or a woman, I have to know what those things are. The breaking down of traditional gender roles shows it's not what activities you do or what jobs you have. Biology and the existence of intersex people shows the body you're born in or the chromosomes you started with don't decide your gender either. Societal norms are steadily being dismantled, so feminine versus masculine presentation isn't a determining factor. So when you remove all of those things from consideration, what else is there? This philosophical debate of what is a man and what is a woman makes many autistics realize we don't have an answer. So we don't feel like either, leading to a significantly high rate of non-binary autistics. With autistics coming to terms with who they are and recognizing it at a younger age, this means a far greater likelihood of coming across queer autistic students. Teens are already at a higher risk of suicidal ideation, so adding the likelihood of being targeted for bullying due to being trans raises the potential for self-harming exponentially. This is why asking for and using chosen names and correct pronouns are so important. The infinitesimally simple change has proven to decrease the chance of suicidal behaviours up to 50%. Among autistics, it is commonly reported that when sharing gender or sexuality-related information, it is dismissed or ignored by parents, carers, therapists, and teachers because they're autistic. That due to their neurological differences, they don't actually understand enough of the world, of themselves, or of sexuality and gender to truly know what they are. This is a form of infantilization, once again comparing an autistic person's level of understanding to that of a young child. Each colour on the Pride Progress flag has a meaning: life, healing, sunlight, nature, peace, and spirit. The black line is to commemorate those lost to AIDS. The brown line recognises the intersectional experience of queer people of colour, and the pink, blue, and white section represents trans people. In May of 2021, Valentino Vecchietti updated the Progress flag to include the yellow triangle with a purple circle to include intersex people. Once upon a time, people of all genders and sexualities existed exactly as they were, no identification or validation required. There were no labels for anything because those facets of your identity had no relevant impact on the running of society. Royals had concubines of all genders, polyamory was a norm, intersex people were hailed as deities for their rarity. In native cultures, those with both male and female within them were called two-spirit, and they were considered closer to the divine for it. Then, about 2,054 years ago, give or take a few years, this man died for 3 days, and when he miraculously came back to life, he became the figurehead of a new religion, hailed for having returned from the dead. Within this new religion, the binary view of sex was born, with Adam and Eve, and so too was the idea that there was a normal way to exist, with everyone who fell outside of that binary being disordered, damaged, wrong. As Christianity spread throughout the world, its impact had a knock-on effect on everything, including science. Other chromosomal variations were discovered, XXY, XYY, XOXY, XXYY. When their occurrences are mapped out, the data looks like this, where XX and XY are the dominant variations, but others still exist. And when genetic science was in its infancy and still being framed through a Christian lens, the data tracking of these occurrences looked like this, the dual bell curve. A number of variations were labelled female and a number were labelled male. When intersex babies were born with ambiguous genitalia, parents were pushed to choose which sex they would raise their child as, because the idea that a perfectly healthy intersex baby could exist as is was not an acceptable one under the prevailing binary view of sex. The movement for intersex individuals being left as they are when they're born is picking up speed. But because the majority of people are either XX or XY, these other variations are still being seen in mainstream society as mutations, despite them often existing within perfectly healthy people otherwise. The idea that not falling within the majority meant something had physically gone wrong in development is an idea that persists to this day, despite the world progressing, moving away from religion dictating how life should be lived.
Been following along, we've covered that there are at least 3 different areas of the brain that are dimorphic between the sexes, and they each vary independently of one another. So that means you have 2 different possibilities in 3 different regions, so 2 times 2 times 2 is 8 different ways that your brain could be structured between what you might call just male or just female. If you factor in what kind of gonads you have, either testes or ovaries, that's another times 2. But you could also have neither and you could also have both, so we really should be saying times 4, but just for convenience sake, we'll say another times 2. So that means that you have at least 16 different configurations of what you could presumably call someone's gender. And we haven't even factored in sexual orientation. You would have to make different permutations for gay, for straight, for bisexual, for pansexual, for asexual. We haven't factored in intersex people. We haven't factored in Klinefelter syndrome, where you have XXY, that's 3 sex chromosomes. We haven't factored in Turner syndrome, where you have X and then nothing else. We haven't factored in whether you have a penis or a vagina, or both, or neither, or more than one of one or the other, which happens from time to time. If you really want to push the idea that everybody fits into just one out of however many boxes, you are very quickly going to have to come up with dozens, if not hundreds of different categories just to fit this insanely parochial worldview you're keeping. It is so much easier just to say that things like sex and gender and sexual orientation exist on a spectrum. And while it is entirely possible that you're like 100% straight or 100% female, it's also at least equally possible that you land somewhere along this fuzzy gradient. And again, unless you have had your brain scanned and your genome sequenced, you have no idea where you land on this deeply ramified line at this very moment. And that shouldn't bother you. It should make you curious. But to go on telling people things like, you're XY and that means you're a boy and boys act like this, is not only preposterously inaccurate, it is cruel and dangerous. Which brings me to why I care. As someone who is cisgendered and at least mostly straight, you could argue that I don't have a dog in this fight. But the fact of the matter is, I am a scientist and an educator. I care about the truth. I care about human beings, and I especially care about the next generation. Suicide is the second leading cause of death among people from the ages of 10 to 24. Lots of young people think about it. I thought about it at that time. But LGBT people in that age group are almost 5 times as likely to have attempted suicide than their heterosexual peers. And what's worse, LGBT youth who report coming from non-accepting and non-supportive families are 8 times more likely than the other LGBT youth to have attempted suicide. So we're talking about 8 times more likely than the people who are already 5 times more likely than the people who are already stressed the hell out to try to kill themselves. And all of this is hugely exacerbated by the fact that you have idiots on TV and on the internet saying, aha, this high suicide rate proves that this is all a mental disorder. No, it proves that these poor kids are being treated like perverts and freaks for just trying to exist. If the biggest problem that you're having in the 21st century is what people's genitals look like and what they're doing with their genitals in the company of other consenting adults. If that is the needle on your moral compass, I strongly encourage you to reevaluate your priorities.
This infographic shows all of the ways people can branch at each stage of development, from genetic code all the way to puberty. And like Forrest said in the video, unless you've had both your brain and genetics mapped and analysed, you don't know that you are an XX female or an XY male, regardless of what body you have or what your brain's telling you. So it may very well be that these other chromosomal sexes occur at a far higher rate than traditionally believed. With all these variations in what biological sex can actually be, not being validly recognised by those who cling to the idea of binary sex, that's what leads to the poor mental health outcomes Forrest was talking about in the video. Everyone exists within this mess that is biological sex, and when we're told you're either this or this, and that leads people who feel like they don't belong in either category to seek out new ones, more gender labels are developed as a way to help them understand who they are better. The binary view of sex causes people to feel like there's something inherently wrong with them when they don't fit into it, despite who they are being built into their very bodies. And that should be enough of a reason to boot the idea of binary sex, even without taking its wild inaccuracy into account. Accommodations are modifications to tasks and environments that make them more accessible to disabled people. Ramps and elevators for those in wheelchairs, voice-to-text for those unable to write, time allowances for those with delayed processing, AAC devices for non-speakers, and specific lighting, clothing, and auditory choices for those of us with sensory issues. The two most common accommodations I have seen expressed within the autistic community are the dismantling of the idea that physical speech is a superior form of communication above all others, and allowing people to communicate in whichever manner feels the most comfortable and effective for them, and having our speech and behavioural patterns taken at face value. No more looking for hidden messages when there aren't any, and seeing behaviours as the regulatory and processing functions they are. The COVID-19 pandemic saw a worldwide shutdown of many workplaces. With economic downturn likely, companies and governments pulled out all the stops to ensure workplaces were equipped with the resources they needed to keep their employees working remotely. As wonderful as this was, many disabled employees all over the world were hurt that accommodations they had been requesting for years had been denied. Teleconferences, working from home, ongoing access to mental health services, being told they were not possible or were unreasonable. A large number of the autistic population is or underemployed due to a lack of accommodation provisions. Having access to them would significantly impact autistic poverty rates. A major concern is that as the world reopens, the accommodations disabled students and employees will need will be taken away again, and it is already being reported in the autistic community that this is already starting to happen. This list of accommodations is extensive, but definitely not exhaustive, much like the lists of co-occurring conditions and the list of autistic traits. This lists the most common accommodations: AAC devices, noise-cancelling headphones, assistance animals or support workers, having extra time, working online, modifying tasks or environments, and taking breaks. This module is specifically dedicated to sharing the majority opinions as collected directly from the online autistic communities. As such, there are many controversial topics being discussed and a rather long list of content warnings to be aware of. Vetting the research you use as a basis for your autism knowledge is the most pivotal step in the process of learning about autism, because even all peer-reviewed research is not made equal. Despite Catherine Crompton's success with the diffusion chain experiment, there are still many neurotypical researchers out there continuing to frame autism as a problem to be solved, and this is evident in the language they use and the lack of autistic involvement in the process. With research proving that autistics are the experts in our condition, any research that does not have autistic involvement from either researchers or the autistic communities is immediately suspect. The main issue with neurotypical autism researchers is that with no autistic involvement in the process, the neurotypical interpretation of the data and results is the only one considered. And given the lack of lived experience, even the most recent research will likely be wrong despite the physical data being sound. I have yet to come across an autism research paper that had no autistic involvement that didn't contain problematic and offensive language, misinterpretations of the resulting data, and recommendations of ways to change natural autistic behaviours for the purposes of successful social integration. I started reading one study on autistic special interests, SPINs, and after dry heaving my way through a person-first language and functioning label-riddled abstract, I made it through one paragraph of the introduction. There was not a single line that didn't have false correlations or harmful generalizations that my most basic knowledge as an autistic person couldn't pick apart. That has a causal relationship going the wrong way. That is a correlation without causation. This third separate thing you haven't even considered causes both of them. That is specifically framing a behavior as negative despite the reality that at worst it's neutral, at best it's highly positive. It was said that intervening to reduce or hide special interest would be considered if negative consequences included things like sibling embarrassment. If I had a therapist tell me I needed to reduce or hide my spin in Pokemon from when I was a kid because my sisters were embarrassed, my ODD would have squared up and had me wearing Pikachu onesies to school every day out of pure spite. I couldn't read any further. It was like reading a flat earth manifesto. Another used phrases like idiot savant and tantrums, and still used IQ tests as a measure of intelligence, a long since debunked pseudoscience. Spins were recognised as having a strong positive impact on autistic well-being, but were still considered maladaptive in the real world due to social impacts. These social impacts mentioned, like the sibling example, all were based on neurotypical reactions to specialization topics, which is not an autistic's responsibility to resolve, but the world's responsibility to change. These studies were in 2017 and 2020 respectively. It flies in the face of actually autistic research showing our level of expertise and that the pathologizing of autism as an affliction is not only scientifically incorrect, but is actively contributing to the ableist rhetoric surrounding the neurotype. A 2019 research paper stated autism gene interactions with environmental factors cause abnormal brain development and so can impact severity of autism, and even if it presents at all. The research cited for this claim was from 2012, and the environmental factors they mentioned were dietary, and so were pushing the idea that autism could be negated or prevented entirely. This idea was debunked by a team of researchers in Australia who proved the gut microbiome was dictated by autism, not the other way around, as assumed by holistic research for no other reason than that the two were connected, because by looking for a cause, they created a confirmation bias, finding an answer that fit what they were looking for without consideration for confounding factors. Research is considered outdated after 5 years. So to use a 2012 research paper that held flawed assumptions, misinterpreted the data, and stuffed many intermingling conditions under the umbrella of autism, alongside many other citations just as old, if not older, to then guide new research and call it current evidence in the field, is academic fraud. These researchers had unrestricted access to autistic scientists and the greater community, and they didn't use it. At this stage in autism research, in this, the age of online connection leading to access to individuals all over the world, not consulting the very people you're studying is tantamount to academic negligence, and this information is then disseminated into the world, perpetuating damaging stereotypes that have no basis in fact. If you want to understand autism, a subjective human experience, physical data is not enough. You need an autistic perspective to provide context for the result's accuracy. Only by including autistic representations in every stage of research, testing, therapy, and educational processes can we be sure that the research is valid and resulting plans and programs are aligned with the autistic community's goals for themselves, rather than aligned with goals others have for us. Much of what we see in mainstream media is heavily stereotyped, showing most autistics as white, middle-class males of genius-level intelligence. They are presented in a way that makes them obviously autistic, by ways of behaviours and social awkwardness, despite the fact that much of the autistic experience is internal and so not observable. But when the only information you're getting as a neurotypical actor is neurotypical information based on neurotypical observations of autistics, the result on screen is not going to be representative of the lived experience of most autistics. Often, they're expected to specifically push to make behaviours more noticeable so the character appears more autistic. Otherwise, how would the audience know? But this only adds to the ongoing stereotyping of autistic behaviour and leads to incredibly poor directorial and production decisions. Your audience might not be able to tell the character is autistic? Good. Many autistics are denied supports specifically because they are not obviously autistic. Showing varied, accurate representations is what will break down the stereotypical views of autism that see those who do have those experiences infantilized and those that don't dismissed and ignored. Sia's directorial debut, Music, was a spectacular failure, with much of the community outraged that Autism Speaks had been used to assist the development of the movie, the fact a restraint scene had been included with no content warning, and that an autistic actor had been fired to make way for Maddie Ziegler as the lead, with Sia first stating the set lights and noises were too much for her and it would be cruel to continue, which is the same as saying, I recognise this workplace isn't accessible, so we're firing you rather than providing you with accommodations that will allow you to do your job, but later admitting she simply couldn't do a project without Maddie. Compare this to our experience with Benedict Cumberbatch's Sherlock Holmes and Alan Turing. Now, the developers of the BBC Sherlock said the character had been designed autistic, but even prior to that, traits had been seen from the character's inception in 1887. The deep attention to detail seen in autistics due to our bottom-up processing rather than top-down, intense involvement in a specific skill set based on a high-interest topic, aka hyperfocus, the notable socially withdrawn behaviours while maintaining few relationships of high significance. There is contention in the Sherlock fandom that he is a high-functioning sociopath, not autistic, with the character even going so far as saying so explicitly. But the writers make a point of sharing that the character envies the psychopaths in mental institutions because of how they can so easily detach emotionally, therefore implying that he can't, a common autistic feeling. Then there's ignoring the fact that he is quite possibly both, with many autistics also having a co-occurring personality disorder. It does not need to be an either-or situation. Alan Turing was indeed autistic, not formally diagnosed, though upon evaluation of behaviours by modern psychiatrists retrospectively, most agree that he would have been given a diagnosis today. His closest advisors within the Enigma project describe his inability to understand social norms. He himself described the desire to run for no other reason than to quiet his brain, a textbook example of autistic stimming, and his proclivity for code cracking led to a hyperfixation that ended a war 2 to 3 years sooner and saved between 14 and 21 million lives. Now, what makes these characters so effective in their autistic representation is the fact that Benedict Cumberbatch didn't play them that way, which made them more human and authentic. The reason for this is hurtful and has caused a lot of pain in the autistic community. Cumberbatch said labeling the characters as autistic was lazy, and that just because people behaved in these ways, that didn't make them autistic. He also said they couldn't possibly be autistic because Sherlock is arrogant and egotistical, while Turing was anything but. But this ignores the massive range of variability in autistic personality. The idea that one autistic is arrogant and another is humble is a perfectly reasonable one, and far more accurate to the autistic experience. So dismissing and refusing to accept the characters as autistic, despite the fact that they were, meant those characters were more accurately representative, because he played the character, not the condition. And that is the main issue when neurotypical actors play autistics. They play the autism, not the character. So Cumberbatch managed to get it right, but the way he got there was with incredibly problematic, ableist, and harmfully stereotypical views, evidenced by his study of autistic teens in a residential care school, in an attempt to effectively play the creature, Adam, also known as Frankenstein's monster. He said that having no memories of being alive prior to being in a fully grown, functioning body would lead the creature to behave like the teens he studied there, having nothing going on cognitively outside of bodily functions and primitive human desires. He said this was why it was so harmful to say that Sherlock and Turing were autistic, because when witnessing teens behave this way, it would give their families false hope. The rhetoric is exactly why so many say that autistic people with complex neurological needs have the mind of a child, because all they know of these people is their observable behaviours, which I will show in a later video is often not the case. What you see externally is guaranteed not to be all that is going on internally. Not only that, these autistic teens have developed differently to the creature. The creature doesn't have the mind of a child either. The brain Frankenstein used was a fully functioning one. If he behaved like anything, it would be a grown man experiencing amnesia after a brain injury, but adult functioning he would still have. The comparison between these teens and Adam, the creature, only reinforced the false high-functioning versus low-functioning dichotomy that leads people to believe autistics are only one or the other, and adds to the harmful stereotypes that dehumanize us all by using these teens' observable behaviors to develop his Frankenstein character. Theodoto Ressa is a Black disabled academic in the US, and he made a point of critically evaluating the misconceptions and misinformation shared through mainstream media about autism when his students suggested he watch a few different TV shows with autistic lead characters. All of them were played by neurotypical actors and fit the same white, middle-class male stereotype. This led Ressa to investigate how this exposure to autism in mainstream media impacted his education students' perceptions of it, and therefore their relationships with their future students. He described something called weight of evidence, which is basically that not all opinion is made equal. In this case, he was pushing the idea that an autistic opinion on autism is going to carry more weight than a neurotypical one, but this doesn't occur in reality. He also explained how, when we're faced with ideas we know little about, we seek out figures of higher authority with more knowledge than us, experts. When the experts on an issue differ in opinion, we turn to our own educators and mentors to find out who's right, and we're likely to believe what they tell us as the truth because of the unspoken assumption that they know more. When these educators and mentors have been raised in a world where mainstream ideas about autism are framed within the medical model, these beliefs are what they pass on, while the actually autistic perspective goes unheard at what is the most pivotal time in a future teacher's education, the time when their perception of autistic students is being formed. Ressa promotes the DSE, the Disability Studies in Education framework, which aims to develop critical literacy skills. So when it comes to evaluating what makes an expert, determining an accurate weight of evidence when comparing two different opinions, and analysing how mainstream media presents specific conditions, future teachers will be less likely to immediately integrate this information without clarifying it with those that actually experience those conditions first, acknowledging that autistics aren't all what they see in many shows and movies, and recognise authentic representations when they are presented. This list could be a lot longer, but if I wrote down every question or statement we hear that we really wish we didn't, I'd run out of slides. Things that imply we aren't autistic because of the way we look or act around a person, which says nothing about the internal experience, dismisses everything autistics live with every minute just existing, and many of us have learned it is simply not safe to let our genuine selves out for fear of backlash. Things that make assumptions about what we can and can't do hurt and are wildly inaccurate because the variability in skills and competencies is the exact same in the autistic community as the holistic. The only thing that's likely to damage those abilities is hearing the person talking to us expressing beliefs about what we can and can't do before we've even been given the chance to showcase them. One of the worst phrases we hear, most commonly right after we're diagnosed, is the heartbroken, "Just found someone has a terminal illness level of devastation. I'm so sorry." I call it one of the worst, not only due to how offensive it is to those who are actually fighting terminal illnesses, but because of how influential it is to an autistic's psyche. That reaction says everything about how the world sees autism. And if you don't know what it means to be autistic outside of these reactions, it becomes yours too, damaging self-esteem and long-term well-being as those negative perceptions are internalized. Using person-first language is considered politically correct, and neurotypical academics and scientists who base their work in the medical model insist it is the correct way to describe autism, because under the medical model, it is an affliction. Illnesses do not make a person, so you wouldn't refer to someone as a cancerous person or a measled person, because it makes no sense, and it centers the disease rather than the person living with it. But under the social model, autism as a condition is a cultural identity. It is a specific way of living in the world, impacted by both internal experiences and external environmental factors. You wouldn't say a person with Aboriginality. Being Indigenous is not an add-on to the person. It, like any culture, is inherent in your being, the foundation your very existence is built on. This goes for conditions as well. Deafness is a disability, but they are still called deaf people, because despite being a medical condition, it is recognized as a valid way to exist. Even when it can be treated with implants, the choice is still left to each individual as to whether or not they want it, something autistic kids don't get. There are those who dismiss the argument entirely, claiming the semantics of autistic person versus person with autism simply doesn't matter, but language always matters. There's a difference between assertive and bossy, between quiet and shy, between the social and the medical. One is positive or neutral, the other is negative. If someone believes it makes no difference, it's because that difference has no bearing on their lives, so we need to start listening to the people that it does, because it is they that will be impacted either positively or negatively, so surely we would want our language choices to have a positive effect rather than a negative one. To those it doesn't affect, a change to community-preferred language shouldn't be a big deal, because it has no negative backlash for them, while the negatives of not using community-preferred language for disabled people is the perpetuation of the medical model, and so the prejudices and discrimination faced continues. Changing the language we use disrupts that cycle, and so has the power to change public perception of disability. This means identity-first language for the collective, while simultaneously respecting individual preferences should an autistic person share that they do prefer person-first language. Because despite many of us sharing the desire for identity-first language, it isn't every single one of us. Language choices should also extend to explicit word choices. A common complaint in the community is euphemisms being used for autism and disability as though they're bad words to be avoided, which follows on to the conditions themselves. On the spectrum, diffability, differently abled, disability, disabled, autistic, autism. None of these are bad words, and avoiding their use implies they are, and so further prejudices the world against autism and disability in general. We say them openly, loudly, unapologetically, and with a goal of the autistic community is to have our global community doing the same.
Too often, autism is described as being mild to severe, low functioning to high, but such labels box an autistic into a specific range of traits, impacting factors and skills. To be high functioning is to always be considered so, leaving those who need supports without them. To be low functioning is to lack competence, incapable of understanding or learning things or taking care of yourself. Neither of these things are accurate. Autistic experience is fluid, dependent on our internal and external environments. Those considered high functioning become less so when they're sick, overwhelmed by certain sensory stimuli, or in unfamiliar social settings, struggling to speak, form coherent thoughts, needing darker spaces or noise-cancelling headphones when they usually don't. Those considered low functioning, when given the right environment, can show skill development nobody thought possible, with AAC training allowing them to communicate when many believed they can't. Medications can impact executive functioning, reduce tics and seizures. Accommodations improve mobility, modifying content and delivery enables learning, enhancing reading ability with auditory input, promoting uptake and retention of information with visuals. If a description of any kind is required, it's listing of specific supports that is needed. Teachers, therapists, childcare providers, they need specifics as to what the person needs to thrive and the modifications required for tasks and environments to be inclusive. A functioning label is too vague to provide that information. That dichotomy of low and high, the spectrum from mild to severe, is starting to look a lot different from what it did at the beginning, huh? Now let's dismantle it completely. Autism, as described in the DSM-V, has two areas of impact: social communication and restrictive and repetitive behaviours. That's it. Nothing involving muscle development, nothing about cognitive ability, nothing about seizures, tics, or loss of bodily control. And yet these are the presenting issues many will describe when they are asked what low-functioning or severe autism is. These conditions associated with being highly impacted by a disability, like intellectual or musculoskeletal disorders and the like, are not autism. But they so often co-occur, leading people to place an amalgamation of disorders all intermingling and impacting each other under the one umbrella of autism, leading people to believe they're one and the same, or that removing the autism will impact these other conditions. Any medical treatment that alters the experience of the more heavy-hitting traits, either internally or externally, won't change them being autistic. Therein lies the fallacy of functioning labels. There's no such thing as severe autism. You label something inherent in the individual as a disorder because it causes them to behave in a manner different from the majority, and that leads to people believing it's something that can be, and therefore should be, changed. And the intersectionality between autism and other specific disabilities is ignored, believing that if they're all neurologically based, fixing one fixes them all. Even if treatments were designed to enable those with musculoskeletal conditions to get out of their wheelchairs and repair neuronal connections that were delayed, damaged, or stunted during development to resolve intellectual disabilities, there's no way to restructure an otherwise healthy autistic brain that simply makes its connections differently to a neurotypical one. The only treatments that would be considered autism cures would only be considered so because they resolve co-occurring conditions, and the people invested in the development of these treatments are too biased or ignorant to recognize the difference. This holds true even for the holistic scientists, who continue to study our genetics. One study stating, gene-environment interaction can lead to epigenetic abnormalities and cause alterations in the brain anatomy and connectivity characteristic for ASD. This is saying that environmental factors can cause genetic abnormalities that cause or worsen the severity of autism, despite these genetic abnormalities actually causing different conditions altogether. They describe how various karyotypes in autistics are also associated with intellectual disabilities, personality disorders, learning disorders, and epilepsy, showing the correlation between neurodivergent conditions and the likelihood of having co-occurring conditions. But they still discuss their research as though all of these various separate conditions are caused by or are an add-on to being autistic, and so continue to lump them together and call them severely autistic, despite the more accurate phrasing, neurologically complex. Now in Australia, we have the 1 to 3 level system rather than a functioning label system, where the number assigned describes the level of supports required to bring a disabled person to an equitable level of participation in society in line with their peers. But even that isn't specific enough, because the tier of supports needed for one person may require level 1 social supports but level 3 medical supports. Assigning them to a level 1 or 2 will not get them the necessary supports for what they need when they're a level 3 medically, and assigning them to a level 3 automatically leads to assumptions about someone's capabilities in other arenas before we've even met them. What should be done is a multi-level system, where there is a described tier for each arena, social, academic, medical, and what accommodations or modifications are required in each and the conditions under which that level can change. A person is a level 1 socially? This is based on them being in a familiar environment with sensory accommodations such as non-fluorescent lighting and a cooler temperature with people they are comfortable with. Put that same person in the same room when the air conditioner breaks and watch their auditory processing rate drop. Put a new person in there with them and they hit a level 2, experiencing situational mutism. Put them outside in summer and see how quickly they deteriorate from a level 1 to a level 3, completely withdrawing into themselves, unable to speak, their body dissociating from their brain, dulling the senses, dissociating in what is a complete shutdown. That is what the autistic spectrum truly is. Not less autistic to more autistic, not mild to severe, not low to high functioning, but every support in every arena being different for every person, dynamically changing in every environment, all of which being subject to change naturally due to regular old human growth and development that occurs with age.
The number of self-diagnosed autistics is growing for a number of reasons, predominantly the gatekeeping by medical practitioners. AFABs and people of colour often have their symptoms dismissed or misdiagnosed, which was mentioned previously due to stereotyping causing the idea that autism has a specific look when it doesn't. Low access to healthcare and socioeconomic factors can also impact the ability to even try and seek a diagnosis. The vast majority of the autistic community recognises these barriers, and those of us professionally diagnosed actively acknowledge that privilege, welcoming and validating self-diagnosed autistics into our ranks. Because family means no one gets left behind. Part of not leaving people behind includes making sure the damage done to our generation of autistics doesn't happen to the next. To those autistics listening who have experienced ABA therapy, I acknowledge your pain, applaud your strength, and apologise for any distress you may experience in this section. ABA, Applied Behavioural Analysis, designed by Ole Ivar Lovaas in the 1960s. Claiming that it would make autistic kids indistinguishable from their peers. ABA is designed around the framework of B.F. Skinner's behaviorism model, using a system of rewards and punishments to alter behaviour through what is called operant conditioning. You punish an undesired behaviour to lessen its likelihood of occurring again. This is called extinction. You reward the behaviours you do wish to see. This is called reinforcement. His first case failed. In the second case, Lovaas became so frustrated with the child not complying to his request, he slapped them. The child instantly complied, and so began the horror that was ABA therapy. Physical abuse, electric shocks, denying access to food, water, attention from carers. The behaviours they were punishing? Stimming, flat facial expressions, not showing affection, not communicating with words. The behaviours they rewarded? Eye contact, hugging people, smiling, speech. 2 boys were shocked when they didn't respond fast enough when told to hug their therapist, of course, with no consideration for delayed auditory processing, especially when the body is in distress. Early in B.F. Skinner's behaviorism trials, he geared his work to focus on rewards rather than punishments for moral and ethical reasons. He also worked with animals. He was deeply disturbed that his work, particularly punishments, had been used against human children. Lovaas went on to utilize these same techniques in the 1970s when he developed gay conversion therapy. This is why ABA is referred to as Autistic Conversion Therapy, designed by the same person for the same reason, making everyone not complying with the majority fall in line. The medical model and ABA practices go hand in hand, because they imply there is something wrong within an autistic person that needs to be fixed, that there is a right way to be a human. But how we relate to the world is deeply personal, expressing emotion, the methods we use to communicate, the interests that spark our fire, the way we build and maintain relationships, the foods we prefer. ABA and the medical model create a hierarchy of humanity, where these very foundations of who we are as a unique individual are tracked on a continuum, where the further along you are, the more mature, functional, and successful you're considered to be. And this correlates directly to an autistic's need to know. Why is physical speech superior to writing, typing, or text to voice? Why is showing happiness and excitement with flapping inferior to smiling or laughing? Why is the desire to protect one's personal space and bodily autonomy comes second to someone else's desire for a hug or a handshake? Variation in human experience is not only a good thing, but a necessary one. No natural human existence is inherently superior or inferior to another's, and autistics maintain the right to exist exactly as we are. Therapists, parents, and researchers claim ABA has changed. Tortuous techniques don't occur anymore. It's all play-based and very gentle, with only rewards being used. These people conflate abuse with physical abuse, despite that much of the damage ABA does is psychological. First, electroconvulsive therapy still happens to this day. In fact, the Judge Rotenberg Center in Massachusetts in the US has received awards for their work on autistic children. Secondly, it isn't only a rewards-based system. Children are strapped down in Rotenberg. Desensitization therapy such as sonic bombardment still happens, with one child recently being exposed to decibel levels that could deafen someone without auditory sensitivities. The boy stopped responding to the noise. The researchers hailed the experiment a success, and neurotypical peer reviewers and ethics boards questioned nothing. Despite being a teenager, they only had parental consent, not his, and they literally tortured him until his brain was so overwhelmed it shut down. ABA clients are still restrained from stimming behaviours, and planned ignoring remains a common concept in ABA training and parenting in general. This is where undesired behaviours are ignored rather than attended to. Meltdowns are called tantrums and are ignored until the child is no longer behaving in this undesirable fashion. The issue here is that behaviours that are communicating a need are labelled as attention-seeking. Sensory issues, hunger, fear, unfamiliarity, everything that has led to the meltdown is dismissed as irrelevant, with compliance to social regulations being the expectation. To get attention and affection, help with the distress, you must meet these expectations, and so a child's needs are dismissed, the message of the behaviour is ignored, and connection to their care provider is only reinstated once they are behaving in a desirable manner. This exact cycle is found in abusive relationships. If you don't behave as the person wants you to, they ignore you until you do what they want. In domestic violence, this is called emotional abuse. In ABA, it's just called therapy. What ABA actually teaches is compliance, using grooming methods predators use to get a child's trust before then exploiting them. The result is often the same: sexual assault. ABA strips away autonomy, trains a person to put others' desires before their own personal needs. Don't stim, it's distracting. Look at me, you're being rude. If you don't hug your auntie, she'll be really sad. No matter what needs these behaviours are meeting, be it communication, regulation, or processing, the person is trained to believe those needs are not important, leaving them subject to abusive relationships with carers, peers, colleagues, and romantic partners in the future because obeying expectations has become the primary goal. So the behaviours that allow us to regulate our feelings, process information, protect us from harmful stimuli are taken away. The result is a neurotypically presenting person, if it worked, but the presentation is all that has changed. What other people see. The drive to stim, still there. The pain of certain noises and visuals, still experienced. The overwhelming feeling of the brain's bandwidth being taken up by a million tabs being open. We're stuck with it because we've been trained that we're not allowed to do what we need to close the tabs. Learning is impacted because who can process and integrate new information when there's so many sensory distractors around? Mental health plummets because every feeling is trapped inside, and the trauma of knowing your carers chose this for you and believing you are not normal and must refrain from ever letting anyone see that damages the chances of developing healthily and trusting relationships in the future. The US Department of Defense released a report showing ABA wasn't even effective in the long term. Studies report roughly half of those undergoing ABA therapy have PTSD as a result, though these figures remain incomplete, as the leading cause of death in autistics who have undergone ABA is suicide. There is not an autistic alive that hasn't opened their mouth to advocate for their needs and not been shut down by a carer, educator, therapist, supervisor, or doctor. For those of us that make advocacy part of our daily life to widen mainstream understanding of autism so the world is better for the next generation, it's a daily, sometimes even hourly, occurrence. People don't like to hear the information they have held as true for so long is wrong. They take it as a deep personal criticism of their character. Parents don't want to be told the choices they made for their kids have hurt them. Bosses don't hear that you require certain accommodations to do your job without hearing, this person can't do their job. Doctors don't respond well to the idea that someone else knows more than they do, that they're not the highest authority in the room, especially not where healthcare is concerned. This leads to the dismissal of autistic voices, kids because they're kids, non-speakers because they use AAC, verbal adults because they're not like their children, students, clients. Many either infantilize us, assuming impaired cognition due to being autistic, or claim that if we can engage in a debate at all, that automatically makes us high functioning, which means we couldn't possibly know what it's like for their child, failing to recognize that many of us were indeed in their child's position, labeled low functioning or severe, failing to acknowledge that all of us were once autistic children, and failing to ask themselves that if we, as autistics, couldn't possibly understand what it's like for their child, how could they? My experience tells me that someone trying to tell you something about your child's condition is taken as them saying they know your child better than you do. This isn't the case. We don't know your child better than you do, but we do know what it is like to be them, and that insight is invaluable. Damon Kurseboom is one such example of how mainstream society assumes childlike intelligence of those deemed low-functioning or severe. There are authors, PhD doctors, world-renowned scientists in just his position, unspeaking, hearing people talk about him like he's not there, like he can't understand, people assuming little to no cognitive development simply because his body doesn't allow him to communicate in what he wishes it to. As he shares, nothing could be farther from the truth.
Hello. My name is Damon Kurseboom, and I am a guy who many would describe as severely autistic. I must admit that I understand why. After all, I have difficulty speaking. I will often say yes when I mean to say no. Some would describe me as non-verbal. At the same time, I hum loudly and frantically repeat phrases, such as "Five Guys, burgers and fries," typically with no relevance to the situation at hand. I have challenges with fine motor movements, such as writing or using scissors. I need a support to perform many activities of daily living, such as cooking or flossing my teeth. I also have difficulty following novel directions, so if I'm asked to go and get the laundry basket, I might come back with a bottle of detergent. I flap. I squint. I definitely stand out. Many people who observe me automatically believe that my behavior reflects my level of cognitive functioning. but they couldn't be more wrong. Do you see what's happening here? Do you see what is at the core of my type of autism? Difficulty speaking. Frantic, repetitive scripting. Fine motor challenges. Difficulty performing activities of daily living, and with following novel directions. Does this make you think of extreme motor challenges? I'm serious. I have been diagnosed with severe apraxia, and this affects the way I move my body and my mouth. I have many non-speaking or minimally speaking autistic friends who describe their challenges as I do. But we can reframe the way we think about non-speaking autistic people. Please, let me explain. 1. I have an extremely overwhelmed sensory system. Not only am I negatively affected by sounds, lights and smells, but I also have difficulty sensing my body, and receive poor neurological feedback. 2. I have extreme anxiety. When I enter a stimulating environment, my anxiety increases immensely. This makes it so difficult to maintain any control of my body or mouth. I might begin to hum or script. I always hope I don't lash out. 3. I can perform learned movements easily, such as using a computer, or cycling. This fools people into thinking that whatever I can do physically reflects my intellectual functioning. Really though, my apraxia means my body and mouth have minds of their own. I need help in order to learn new motions, even though I completely understand what I am meant to do. 4. Speaking of understanding, I do understand the world around me. I have empathy for others. I love jokes, especially dry humor. Just by observing me, however, you will miss knowing what's in my mind. You can't see that I love having close relationships, or that I love reading about Indigenous Canadians, for example. Please know that my actions don't usually reflect my thoughts. 5. I believe that my ability to communicate through spelling on an iPad has saved my life. Being able to communicate means that I have full access to opportunities, such as education, or leisure activities of my choosing. But I must also emphasize that before I learned to type my thoughts, I couldn't ask or answer questions. I couldn't complain that I was anxious, or sick. I couldn't tell people about my hopes for the future. It was tragic. I felt so hopeless. So let's go. Together we can reframe the way people think about non-speaking autistics. Thanks so much.
These different facets of autism are what the vast majority of neurotypical advocates, organisations and charities fail to acknowledge, and blatantly disregard when they're brought to their attention. Having a preference for symbols and colours, avoiding those that don't represent who we are and what we want for ourselves, wanting to put an end to ABA, expecting change in how autism research is done and how therapies are developed, wanting a say in everything. Nothing about us without us. Autism Speaks is the most notorious autism organisation in the world. There isn't an autism-focused group or individual that hasn't heard of them. Started in 2005 by the Rights in the US, it's considered to be the largest and most dangerous autism hate group in America, redesigning and popularising the puzzle piece logo and the Light It Up Blue campaign. They refuse to involve autistic voices in their initiatives, pushing the belief that autistic adults don't exist because they either stay eternal children or must be so high-functioning that they're not even really autistic. They do invite us in from time to time in a performative manner, where the person is a figurehead, there for no other reason than to be the token autistic with no real influence. They seek causes of autism for the purposes of curing or preventing its occurrence, encouraging parents to grieve their child as though they had received a terminal illness, praising them for the burden they carry and the sacrifices they make to have an autistic child. They release marketing materials, such as their I Am Autism campaign video, claiming autism takes parents' children and dreams, causes financial ruin and destroys marriages, comparing it to AIDS and cancer. They have shared and promoted stories from parents of autistics describing the desire to murder their children rather than have them live with a disability, while those very children were present. This behaviour continues to this day with devastating results. Over 700 children killed by their parents in acts of infanticide in the last 5 years. It is no wonder as to why Autistics and our allies avoid this organisation and its campaigns like the very plague they claim us to be. Part of the structure of such organisations is the investigation of autistic genetics. Despite the autistic community condemning further study of what genes correlate with autistic presentation in an attempt to find a causal link. Even now, Simon Baron-Cohen's Spectrum 10K study in the UK has ground to a halt amidst protest from the community and its allies in the university research teams there. After the damage his research has done with his extreme male brain theory and theory of mind, Baron-Cohen has teamed up with the current head of the very ABA clinic that none other than Ole Ivar Lovaas opened in the 1960s, and is trying to collect 10,000 samples of autistic DNA in one of the largest genome projects the world has ever seen. He insists it isn't for eugenics purposes, that he and his team are not seeking to develop gene therapies or a prenatal screening test, that they only want to understand the genome better so more effective supports can be developed. The problem is, even if that's not what their aim is, and very few believe that is the case, in the global community we now exist in, once the research is released, the genie can't be put back into the bottle, and every organisation wanting to develop gene therapies and prenatal tests will have the data to do it. If successful, technological advancement as we know it will likely grind to a halt, as every major leap in scientific understanding is believed to be led by the bottom-up, visual, logical yet out-of-the-box, untamed thinking that comes with being autistic. When Autism Speaks was launched in 2005, it released the puzzle piece logo, and ever since it has been a symbol for autism awareness. It represents the idea that autistics are missing pieces, and that by finding that one missing piece, we could be solved, cured. This is why the medical framing, treatments, cures for autism are at the core of what Autism Speaks does, because they do not believe we are whole as we are. This is why the majority of actually autistic community rejects the puzzle piece as our symbol. It is not representative of who we are. It has dark, ableist origins, was designed by an organisation many autistics want no association with. And we didn't choose it. We chose the infinity for autism acceptance. The time for awareness is over. People know it exists. The goal now is to get our existence acknowledged and validated. The infinity represents the infinite possibilities of autism and other neurodivergent conditions, the way it can present, the co-occurring conditions, the intersectionality of various identities, the environmental impacts on how it's experienced. The rainbow infinity is for neurodivergence. The gold infinity is for autism specifically, gold being AU on the periodic table. The golden rainbow infinities, chosen by the community, representing our genuine, authentic experiences, and presenting our conditions in the way the community wants the world to see them. Going hand in hand with Autism Speaks puzzle piece is the colour blue, chosen because of the misnomer that autism is a male condition, and as such, lacking just as much true representation and accuracy as the puzzle piece symbol. In the autistic community, we go red instead, another bold primary colour in complete juxtaposition with blue, to promote acceptance over awareness. Upon receiving a diagnosis, a lot of parents turn to research and charitable organisations for guidance. There are plenty that prefer to ignore it completely, not believing the diagnosis or not telling their kids they're even autistic because they'll think it will make them feel like they're different, or use it as an excuse to wash their hands of personal responsibility. Those that have developed a negative view of autism from growing up in a world seeing how disabled people are treated and don't ignore it usually go one of two ways: the steadfast ally or the autism mum. Autism mum, autism warrior mummies, autism parents, the autism community, very different from the autistic community, have all become derogatory terms to the autistic community, describing a very specific subsection of the population. Neurotypical people with a close connection to an autistic person, usually in a carer position for them, that ignore autistic expertise. The autism warrior mummy supports Autism Speaks and ABA and refuses to accept autistic adult opinions on language, symbols, and research goals as valid. Among the autistic community, they're also referred to as martyr mummies, seeing autistics as burdens to their family and something they should receive praise for dealing with every day, for their noble and selfless sacrifice. Autism mums make decisions and share opinions on autism based on how they experience life with their autistic person, which is an observation, rather than that of the actually autistic individual who is the one living it. They speak for and over their child, insisting they can't for themselves because they're autistic, making harmful assumptions about cognitive understanding based on outward presentation. They say things like, "My child, sibling, nephew has autism," and they love the puzzle piece. Obviously, children are socialized by their parents and need to reach a certain level of development before they can understand its history or the negative connotations associated with it. Or, "We like the puzzle piece because my child is the missing part of my life." Are you saying they wouldn't be if they weren't autistic? Or, "We prefer person with autism." Who is we? And if they're not autistic, why do they matter more than actually autistic people? Or, "They've only made the progress they have because of ABA. It's made our lives so much better." It's made the parents' lives easier, not the child's. And as a teacher, the assumption a child would not have learnt anything without ABA makes painfully little sense from a child developmental perspective. Autism mums champion the belief that autistic adult opinions don't count because their child is far more than their autism and our experiences are not theirs, while simultaneously being a neurotypical person claiming the autism label for themselves and making it into their entire identity, oversharing private information on social media, even when what's going on has nothing to do with their child being autistic. Sharing another person's private information is considered incredibly invasive in the autistic community, tantamount to outing someone as queer. It is part of the reason most of us are against blue pumpkins on Halloween. At best, it's unnecessary. At worst, it can put us in danger from those who would target those they consider to be vulnerable. The in-between is the mistrust that develops between parent and child due to them feeling like their right to privacy is not being respected. Considered the worst of crimes in this area is parents who record their child in the midst of a meltdown and share it online. Experiencing their worst moments of pain and distress, a child has their carer put a camera on them. Then, after, it is uploaded for all the world to see so the carer can get support for what they have gone through, the very support and comfort they denied the child in that moment. That child then grows up with that video existing in the public eye forever, an eternal example of what we did to our parents, just how hard we were to raise, just what saints our poor, hard done by parents were to go through that. The autism mum actively fights for everything we're against, while denying us agency and autonomy. Luckily, there are so many parents out there that don't do these things, that just let their kids be exactly who they are without change, providing natural accommodations and comforts, actively seeking us out for answers rather than those invested in doing us harm for their own benefit. They don't do things like the autism Christmas tree. I cannot begin to describe just how painful these things are to see. All the ornaments are brightly coloured puzzle pieces. Sensory-wise, it's a visual abomination most of us can't even look at comfortably. Psychologically, I've been in contact with many autistics in the online communities who have been incredibly triggered just by seeing these posts online. Everything from intrusive thoughts and nightmares up to being physically ill and experiencing meltdowns. The autistic community is so grateful to the parents that truly get it, and those that make a point of trying to, even when they're scared of what this all means. We will do whatever it takes to make sure you are not tarred with such a disrespectful and degrading label, including expressing our deepest desire that you don't claim it for yourself thinking it's a good thing, because it's not. Almost all of the issues surrounding autism have a very strong agreement in the autistic community. Self-diagnosis? Yes. Puzzle pieces? No. Color red? Yes. Sharing private info? No. The stats are incredibly skewed, like 90% plus agreeing on those topics. One of the most heated debates between autistics within the autistic community is the Asperger's label. In 2013, it was collapsed into autism in the DSM-V, and the community rioted. They are autistics, and we autistics do not cope well with change, especially rapid, in this case, instant, unexpected change. Not only that, but the label was attached to an identity that many had fought for decades to understand, and it was being taken away. I get it. If I was told after 27 years of struggling to understand who I was, only to find out that understanding came with a name, autism, only to then be told I couldn't use it anymore, you'd be prying my autism label out of my cold, dead hands. Then 2018 happened. Hans Asperger was discovered to have committed horrendous atrocities against autistics and other disabled children, personally selecting those autistics with high intelligence and no impairment to their fine motor skills and giving them a new label, one that spared them from childhood euthanasia, and gave his pediatric clinic in Vienna free labor. Those that didn't meet the criteria he set were sent to the concentration camps, alongside the Jewish and the queer. But because they were disabled and of no benefit to the Nazi regime, they were killed immediately rather than be put to work first, because they couldn't. That is why you don't hear about disabled and queer inclusion in the racial purity initiatives of the Third Reich, because those sporting a pink triangle simply got moved from one jail to another to finish out their sentences for crimes against human sexuality and gender conformity. And when the camps were finally liberated, there were no disabled people left alive to free. Naturally, this led to a mass revolt and discarding of the Asperger's label, but even now, that is a privilege some are denied. Asperger's, while still a disability and a diagnostic label, has stereotypical connotations that says, this person is odd but incredibly intelligent and will be successful. Autism has a very different connotation, making people see a far more disabled person than someone labeled Aspergic. Lower expectations for future success, lower assumed intelligence, despite all these variations, still just being autism. Because of the high level of prejudice many areas of the world have against autistics, and the fact that not all countries follow the DSM-V, Asperger's is still a diagnosis that is given, even today, and it can quite literally be risking someone's life if it is believed they are autistic. As such, the Asperger's label can act as a necessary protective function against discrimination. I make a point of asking those autistics who use the Asperger's or Aspie labels if they are aware of its history, and inform them of the necessity to use a content or trigger warning when discussing and using these terms, just as I have here. If they don't, I urge them to investigate it, offering to share what I know, but not just telling them outright. This information is far too confronting for that. If they do, the expectation is that the label is respected for the individual. Personal autonomy is the pinnacle of the civil rights autistics are fighting for. As such, any label choice is valid, so long as it is an informed one. To be able to teach autistics, we have to be able to understand how they think, experience emotions, process information, analyze their background and how it has impacted how they view the world and their place in it, and consider what other facets of their identity will be intersecting with all of that. It is no small task, but the compassion and understanding we show has the power to change the entire trajectory of the autistic experience. We cannot take such a vital opportunity for granted, and it starts with parents, therapists, and teachers. These next slides describe how autistic students experience more adversity and mental health issues than their neurotypical peers, but this has yet to be studied extensively. The research cited here discusses how autistic adults have valuable insight into why this occurs and should be involved in further study so the links can be investigated more efficiently. This research also describes underdiagnosis. Autistics are less likely to be diagnosed with other conditions they have despite meeting the criteria for them, as they are often attributed to the person being autistic rather than recognizing it for what it is, another condition. The result of this is often that the student does not get the supports they need for their other conditions, because the diagnosis is what allows them the knowledge and often the funding to do so. An autistic student doesn't get diagnosed with ADHD because executive dysfunction is just a part of being autistic. No access to medical prescriptions that can help positively impact their learning. They're just anxious because they're autistic? No, anxiety is not an autistic trait. It is caused by trauma and must be treated as such, not simply dismissed as part of their autism. My intersecting conditions are many and varied. I was given my ADHD diagnosis, for which I was incredibly grateful, being hyperacutely aware of what a privileged position I was in to get it. The medication worked wonders for the ADHD symptoms that made certain tasks difficult, but my overall well-being plummeted because another of my intersecting conditions were being exacerbated by the stimulant medications you're prescribed for ADHD. My anxiety shot through the roof as a result. I was constantly scared. It was like the boss battle music you hear in games was playing all the time, but the danger never showed up. I destroyed my fingers biting and picking at my nail beds and fingertips, a self-harming stim to cope with the distress, to the point I had to keep my fingertips wrapped in band-aids just to stop myself from getting at them. This would have been avoided if the intersectionality of co-occurring conditions was taken into account. Accounts such as mine and those of other autistic adults are described to be essential to studying adversity, well-being, and resilience in autistic students. Here's to hoping the researchers focusing on this area heed that message. The more educators understand about what is happening internally in an autistic student, the easier the environment can be adjusted to minimize anxiety and sensory stresses and maximize learning potential. Pushing through for a higher grade or better attendance despite distress leads to faster burnout and longer recovery time, ultimately resulting in lower grades and attendance overall, with the added impact to self-esteem, as these things are internalized as being more important than their well-being. It has been seen in many different educational settings that neurodivergent students struggle in environments not designed for people like us. But interestingly, neurotypical students do benefit from environments specifically designed for neurodivergence. We need to be letting the data and our students speak for themselves. It is necessary that carers, therapists, doctors, and teachers don't simply accept a diagnosis like the marriage at the end of a Disney movie, where all that's left is happily ever after. Because just like real life, there's mortgages and responsibilities and paying bills. Given how common mis- and underdiagnosis is in autistics, remaining vigilant is an absolute necessity, because any behavioural changes or academic difficulties that these students are experiencing that get written off as a part of being autistic could very easily be co-occurring conditions that go unsupported. Quite a lot of the content in this section comes to us courtesy of the Neurodivergent Insights, an autistic therapist with a PhD in the US. I'll only be touching on each of these co-occurring conditions lightly, as each of these conditions would require their own full presentation to truly understand them. The first condition is one of the most commonly occurring, ADHD. This Venn diagram shows just how much crossover there is between the trait sets. Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, so named due to appearing inattentive, easily distractible, and hyperactive. But the experience is far more complex than that, involving impaired executive functioning that impacts memory, choice, impulsivity, and motivation. The inability to filter out unnecessary stimuli means instead of being able to focus on a conversation with your partner or the teacher talking, the brain cannot prioritize the sensory stimuli from the environment, and so noise of cars driving past outside, people moving around you, new or bad smells, all of that is getting equal access to your brain's resources, thus the distraction. This then impacts your ability to process and retain the information being presented, which is where the underlying learning and memory issues come in, because you can't learn new things or remember what was said in a conversation or what appointments have been booked for when, if your brain is thrown off when trying to process it. It's the difference between listening and comprehending, similar to someone having a conversation in a language you're not familiar with. You can be trying to understand what they are telling you with every fiber of your being, but if your brain can't comprehend the message, you're not going to be able to. Stimulant medications slow the brain down, giving it time to filter out these distractors and consider the immediate environment, resulting in being more present in the moment, increasing memory retention and focus, and lowering impulsivity that has likely led to reactive and dangerous behaviors in the past. Dyspraxia is the least considered of the explicit learning disorders due to the underlying assumptions that come with it. Because it involves impacted coordination in both fine and gross motor skills and slower processing of information, people tend to believe dyspraxic individuals have lower cognitive development, which is rarely true, leading them to be infantilized by being treated like a child and spoken to with baby talk. Dyslexia is one of many learning-specific disorders that can be co-occurring in autistics. It impacts the brain's ability to code and decode words quickly or accurately, impacting writing, reading, and reasoning skills.
Dysgraphia is based in writing skills, spatial awareness, and difficulty in developing phonological understanding due to executive dysfunction impacting memory results in a struggle to write. Pacing is slow, which makes it hard to compose writing because you need to think of what word you're up to and what you wanted to say and what you have said so far to figure out what comes next. Fine motor skills make letter formation difficult, spacing between letters is hard to control, and handwriting is poor as a result. Larger pencils, more time to complete tasks, and pencil grips are common accommodations.
Dyscalculia is similar to dyslexia, but with numbers rather than words, making it difficult to develop mathematical understanding, read or write numbers and symbols, or manipulate numbers for time planning or financial management. With numeracy being such an important skill set to most industries, it can result in lower employment outcomes. Generalized anxiety disorder is a constant state of impending doom, fear, dilated pupils, higher heart and respiratory rates. It's that boss battle music playing constantly that I discussed previously. Social anxiety is more specific, directly relating to social settings. Obsessive-compulsive disorder is closely correlated to anxiety disorders. Similar to autism, OCD involves repetitive behaviors, but in OCD they are a direct response to the obsession and the resulting intrusive thoughts. Anxiety builds around an obsession, the most commonly known being cleanliness, with thoughts becoming more persistent and extreme until the compulsion occurs. In this case, whatever is considered dirty is made clean again. It is necessary to understand that the obsession and resulting intrusive thoughts cannot be controlled. Only the resulting compulsive behavioral response can. As such, there are a lot of intrusive thoughts involved in OCD that horrify and disgust those that experience them. It is vital to make it clear that these thoughts are not who they are, and that most people experiencing the more extreme and dangerous intrusive thoughts fight them every day of their lives. Examples include relationship, contamination, harm, just right, or what I call Goldilocks, pure O, which is obsession without a resulting physical bodily compulsion, and pedophilia. Avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, what many call picky eating, is anything but. Sensory aversions, gastrointestinal problems, unfamiliarity, and poor interoception leading to missed hunger cues within the body are the cause. It is not an eating disorder, as controlling weight by restricting caloric intake is not the goal. It can, however, lead to an eating disorder as the more pressure is placed on a person experiencing ARFID, the more likely they are to reject food entirely due to negative food experiences. Never force or schedule food. The more pressure there is, the less likely there is to be a positive result. Introducing new foods should be done slowly, adding new sensory experiences over time. The new food should be similar to what's called a same food, a food that is already safe and familiar. It is then added to the options for food. Putting it on a plate or in a lunchbox is already visually stimulating. Then, when it is a familiar sight, add smell, then touch, then taste. It can mean the food is offered 20 times before it's actually eaten or spat out, but it means less pressure, less distress, and less likelihood of a future unhealthy relationship with food. Post-traumatic stress disorder is developing nightmares, flashbacks, panic attacks, and other autonomic nervous system responses as a result of experiencing a traumatic event. Originally seen in war veterans returning home, it has since been found to occur as a result of any experience, as what each individual considers and experiences as traumatic varies. This infographic is the correlation between ADHD and PTSD, as ADHD people are more likely to be victimized and targeted. As such, the stats here hold true for autism also, as the traits that get these kids targeted are similar in both groups. CPTSD is a more recent discovery. This is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Instead of there being one major traumatic event, like a shooting or an explosion, it is a series of connected events occurring over time, such as ongoing child abuse or domestic violence. This is why intersectionality is so important and underdiagnosis is so dangerous. Experiencing PTSD will amplify many autistic and ADHD traits, and the presence of co-occurring conditions will impact what treatments can be used. You can see here that the very stimulant medications that help with ADHD are contraindicated for those with PTSD. This makes early diagnosis all the more important also. The earlier co-occurring conditions are recognized and treated, the less likely traumatic social targeting is to occur, and the less likely CPTSD is to develop as a result.
Mood disorders such as depression, bipolar, premenstrual, and disruptive mood regulation lead to a person's emotional state to not match their current circumstances. Postpartum depression is an easy example here. It is usually considered to be one of the most positive experiences one can have, but this experience is distorted by other factors such as hormonal changes and environmental stimuli that the person has little to no control over. In autistics, it's easy to experience so much negative backlash in social situations that our emotional state is impacted even in positive ones because our brain stops being able to differentiate the two.
Depressive symptoms can be a result of bullying and ostracism leading to self-isolation, but they can also be caused by autistic burnout from prolonged masking or overstimulation. And knowing the difference is necessary because it changes what treatments, medications, and supports are required to resolve it.
Personality disorders are some of the most heavily stigmatized. Borderline, narcissistic, avoidant, antisocial, histrionic, they're characterized by unhealthy ways of thinking and behaving. BPD is one such disorder, and as I described, These thought processes are out of the control of, and often just as alarming to, the person experiencing them than the people observing the resulting behaviour.
I've made a specific point of including comparative information on schizophrenia and schizoid personality disorder because many people either haven't heard of schizoid personality disorder or assume the conditions are the same thing. Schizophrenics experience complete breaks from reality, with hallucinations and psychosis. Schizoid is also a dissociation or detachment, but from connections or relationships with people. Socializing has no beneficial value, and validation from others is rarely a consideration. I had compliance drilled into me as a child in ABA, where both food and things I love were withheld for compliance and effective masking of my autistic traits. I developed a fawn trauma response. What was taught to me is that my existence as is unacceptable. This carried over into adulthood in a flurry of giving more than I receive, being satisfied with crumbs, existing as an afterthought, and needing to constantly justify why I deserve a seat at the table. As an adult and as an advocate, the goal is to be so openly and authentically myself that other people feel safe in doing so. If existing in a world that isn't built for me, around people who don't accept me, has taught me anything, it's taught me that if you need to constantly justify your seat at the table, it's time to build a new table. Quote by J.J. Mudridge, Autistic Self-Advocate. And building a new table is exactly what will happen, because nothing about us without us. At the end of this presentation is a glossary, as well as a resource list with all the information cited throughout, as well as additional resources for further information. Those highlighted in red are a must-see. The information they contain is paradigm changing, and it needs to be seen by as many as possible if we are to create real change. The blue are highly recommended. The yellow are those considered interesting, but not necessarily weight-bearing.
A massive thank you to those who allowed me to use their material for this presentation. It wouldn't be what it is without them. I strongly encourage people to investigate these spaces and join these communities. They have educated the or misinformed, changed life trajectories, impacted autistic self-image, and as a result have literally saved lives. Thank you for your time, your talent, and your spoons.
As promised, this was not a professional presentation. It had far too many personal anecdotes, it was full of tweets and comics, it was not an informatively presented PL. This is because when the personal and the professional implications of the information being presented are so intimately linked, it's not possible to separate them. This view of autism can't be presented by an objective neurotypical professional without losing the full weight of its message. And it can't be presented by an autistic without the deeply personal investment being unprofessionally evident in the delivery. This dichotomy adds weight to the claim that just because something is professional, that doesn't necessarily make it appropriate, and that some things aren't inappropriate simply because they're unprofessional. I am hyper-acutely aware that the likelihood of my career being a long-lasting one is low. To be honest, I'm surprised I made it this far. Presenting this information when it so vehemently opposes the status quo is the kind of boat rocking that gets you noticed for all the wrong reasons, and has the very real possibility of leading to the end of my career sooner rather than later. But regardless of what the consequences are for me personally, the implications for the future are far greater.
I'm the one that doesn't keep it in. I'm the one that can't. Casual teachers being mistreated or disrespected don't want to risk speaking up when it can mean their livelihood is at stake. So I do. Am I going to be invited back to that school again? Not with how I make a fuss. But I know that school is likely going to remember me because I spoke up. And when the next casual walks through that door, then just maybe the sacrifice on my part will mean it's better for them. And that's the point. Actively advocating for this sort of radical change has almost zero chance of ending well for me. By pushing for understanding and acceptance for autistics, I'm only one voice, and I can only get it so far. But if I have the chance to impact future generations, that's a grenade I'd gladly fall on. Because even the tiniest ripple now has the ability to change everything for people like me, students and teachers alike. Maybe instead of 6 autistic teachers being identified in all of New South Wales, fearing losing their positions if they disclose or fail to meet professional expectations, there'll be hundreds, with long, full careers, providing autistic students the representation they have long needed and always deserved. And no matter where I am or what's happened to me as a result, it will have been worth it, because it was never about me. Those within the New South Wales Department of Education can contact me via the Neurodivergent network on Yammer or my department email, CourtneyWatts8. For external inquiries, please direct them to the Ballads and Bards Bookhouse email, info@balladsandbardsbookhouse.com.